Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and you're very welcome to this morning's Legume Innovation and Networking Workshop, which is brought to you by Teagasc and the True Network. The Legumes Innovation Network seeks to identify transition paths enabling homegrown legumes in more sustainable food and feed value chains. The title of today's webinar is that the EU Green Deal aims to lower mineral fertilizer in use, the essential role of legumes. Our aim here today is to examine the prospects for greater legume use in agriculture and to get a better understanding of the obstacles to adoption at farm level. And we have a superb lineup of speakers and videos for you today, and we expect lots of interaction from you, the audience. I see that we have participants from Kenya, Spain, Portugal, Turkey, United Kingdom, and County Wexford. And that's just a short few of the participants that we have here today. So you're all very, very welcome. And of course, we'd love to welcome you all here to Ireland, but for this event today, sadly, the global pandemic has ruled that out. So our first speaker today, I'm delighted to introduce to you is James Humphreys, who is a principal research scientist with Teagasc based at Moore Park, which is a centre of excellence for research into pasture-based dairy production. And James works on dairy systems research with a focus on lowering the environmental footprints of pasture-based systems with 25 years of experience using legumes in grassland. And James is also one of the lead organisers of today's event. So James, good morning to you. How are you today?
Good, Mark. And
great,
thanks
great.
For the introduction.
You're very welcome. So James, you're going to give us an overview of the workshop here today, and we will hand over to you, and after James will be introducing you to Pete Yanata.
Okay, thanks, Mark. What I'm going to do really is to set the scene here for the non-Irish members of the audience, just to explain some of the background to Irish agriculture. Pete will explain about the LIN network in a few moments' time on behalf of Teagasc and the True partners in the Teagasc partners in the True project. I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar. So in terms of greenhouse gas emissions per capita, this is from selected European countries. You can see that one country tends to stand out when we look at agriculture as a proportion of total emissions. You can see that Ireland, that's where we are. You can see the proportion coming from agriculture is high. So there's really two messages on this slide. One is, and by European standards or by world standards, we have high emissions per capita, and a high proportion of our emissions come from agriculture. And if we didn't have such high emissions from agriculture, we'd probably be a bit lower down the scale in terms of our emissions. Our emissions are 13.2 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per capita per person. If we look at Denmark, for example, a country with a similar population size, also the second highest dependence on agriculture in terms of emissions, much lower emissions. We compare ourselves to our nearest neighbour, the UK, 7.5, which is about half of our emissions. Of course, it's very different. UK is far more industrialised than Ireland. And then Sweden, which has the lowest emissions in Europe, 5.4 tons, which is 2.5 times lower. So there are big challenges for Ireland in this regard. And if we think about agriculture, we might ask the question, why is agriculture such a big proportion? It's partly because we have a relatively large area, small population relative to that area, and a high dependence on animal-based agriculture and grassland-based agriculture. And most of our agricultural land is used for grassland, and it's used for dairy, beef, and sheep production. And 90% of what we produce is exported. 40% to the UK, also to other EU countries, and about 40% then goes to non-EU countries in terms of dairy production or dairy exports. And in terms of beef, then we're the fifth largest beef exporter in the world, which is surprising for such a small country. And a lot of our beef exports goes to the UK and also to other EU countries. This table here shows land use in 2020 and also in 1850. And we can see the grassland, the amount of land under grassland has hardly changed in that 170 years. The amount of land under crops has declined. There was a far greater dependence on cropping in 1850. A large proportion of the population existed on subsistence agriculture based on the potato. And also there was a need to grow oats there was a lot more horses and beasts of burden used for agricultural purposes at that time. The amount of land under crops continues to decline. It has declined around 10% over the last 10 years. And that's mainly conversion over to dairying. It's a simple explanation. We also grow peas and beans, around 8,000 hectares, which is relatively small in the greater scheme of things. We can look back much further than 1850. If we go back to the time when Britain was part of the Roman Empire, Pomponius Mena here visited Ireland, and he commented that the climate of Ireland was unfavorable for grain production, and indeed that grass grows so richly that cattle burst if unrestrained from eating it. Now, as bizarre as that statement might seem, it does have a ring of truth about it, because it's well known that bloat can be a problem in cattle if they're eating clover-rich grassland. And there's no doubt that the Iron Age Irish were making use of clover to fix nitrogen for their nitrogen demand in grassland, because grassland has a high demand for nitrogen. Now, the climate and soils are more suited of Ireland are more suited for grassland than for tillage. We have a mild, temperate, and damp climate. It's influenced by the Gulf Stream here. And you can see our mean temperatures here go from 5.4 degrees in January to 14.7 in July. So it's a climate that has been described as being a Goldilocks climate. It never gets too hot or it never gets too cold. And it's not also that we get exceptionally high rainfall. You can see the range here, averaging around 1,000 mils per year. But it does tend to rain frequently, and also our evapotranspiration rates are relatively low. So that makes it difficult for ground to dry out for cultivation, and also for crops to dry out for harvesting. So this slide here shows family farm incomes and direct payments in Irish farms. So the family farm income is here, and this is part of the family farm income, the direct payment. And you can see here that on beef and sheep farms, that without direct payments, these farms would be operating at a loss. They'd be losing money. Now, dairy farming has the capacity to generate a much higher income than the other enterprises, and that's part of the reason we've seen a move over to dairy production during the last 5 or 6 years, since the abolition of the milk quota. Beef farming and sheep farming is primarily conducted by part-time farmers that have other employment. And we can see, if we compare this to the national average wage, we can see that dairy farming can generate a better income, a better farm income, and these are family farm incomes than the national average wage. Dairy farmers would say that they have to invest heavily in their businesses, that they have to take risks, and they also have to work much longer hours under difficult conditions than the other occupations, and that's true. And of course, we've seen a big increase in exports of dairy products over the last 10 years or so, and this is important for our national economy. And these exports are mainly going to non-EU countries where there's growing demand for dairy products. And as I said, it's important for our economy. This slide then, just to bring us back to the topic of today, is shows fertilizer nitrogen use in Ireland since 1930. We can see that until around the beginning of the 1970s, there was very little nitrogen fertilizer used in Ireland. After World War II, there was a food crisis in Europe. There was concern about food security, and farmers were actively encouraged to modernize and increase food production. And this is what's known around the world as a green revolution, during which huge strides were made to improve food security and lower food poverty in many countries, and famines were reduced around the world. Now, Ireland joined the EU or the European Economic Community, as was known at that time, in 1972, and became a full member in 1979. And it was a period of very rapid progress, and coincided with a huge increase in nitrogen fertilizer use. The milk quota was introduced in 1984, and we see a slowing down in nitrogen fertilizer use from then onwards. There was beef and sheep production were still encouraged up until 1998, when we had the introduction of decoupling of support payments from production and this process of extensification. And after that, we see a reduction in nitrogen fertilizer use up until 10 years ago. The milk quota was abolished, and there's been a rapid increase in the size of the national dairy herd, going from 1 million to over 1.5 million dairy cows at the present time. And we see, coinciding with that, an increase in fertilizer use. And this is a matter of concern for policymakers, both increasing cow numbers, generating more methane, and also more fertilizer, which generates nitrous oxide. Because dairy farming tends to be more intensive in terms of nitrogen fertilizer use and other resources, and also in terms of its impact on the environment. And this is a big dilemma for the industry and for policymakers. How do we maintain and continue to expand our dairy industry while lowering environmental impact to meet targets for greenhouse gas and ammonia emissions, and also water quality? Now, the water quality in Ireland is high compared to elsewhere. We have high quality water, and it's imperative that we maintain that high quality and not see a deterioration. So we now have the Green Deal, and in contrast to the earlier green revolution that I talked about, we now need to have a different kind of green revolution to reverse some of the negative consequences of the first one. And that's the purpose of today's webinar. Now, the Irish government, compared to a baseline here of around 400,000 tonnes of nitrogen fertilizer being used, the target is to reduce that to 350,000 tonnes by 2025 and down to 325,000 tonnes by 2030. Those targets are in line with the farm to fork strategy in the European Green Deal. Now, pasture-based farming has deep roots in Ireland, and the use of legumes and grassland was important to underpin productivity historically. The Romans brought Christianity to Britain, and this man, St. Patrick, brought Christianity to Ireland. Now, legend has it that he explained the concept of the Holy Trinity in the Christian tradition to the Iron Age Irish using the trifoliate leaf of clover. It's quite clear that the choice of clover was no accident, and that clover had a particular significance and importance to the local population. And that cultural inheritance has stayed with us to this day. I'm not aware of any other nation that celebrates the legume with such enthusiasm as the Irish, both here at home and around the world. So with that, I'll hand you back to Mark and the rest of the proceedings.
Thank you, James, for that excellent introduction. Very appropriate, given the month that we're in as well. Law Féile Pádraic isn't far away, or St. Patrick's Day, in the middle of this month. So thank you for that opening. I'd now like to call on our next speaker, Pete Yanata, who is head of ecological food systems and subgroup of agroecology at the James Hutton Institute in Scotland. Pete focuses his mainly applied research to help realize more sustainable feed and food value chains. He is the coordinator of the True project and an advocate of legume innovation networks, which aim to foster the necessary value chain-wide partnerships and capacities for greater use of homegrown legumes. And Pete is going to tell us about the Legume Innovation Network. Good morning to you, Pete.
Good morning, Mark. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you, James, as well, for that fantastic background report on what you face here in Ireland. I'm going to share my screen. I've only 10 minutes to share what is quite an ambitious project. So I'll share my screen now, and hopefully that will appear for you.
Thanks, Pete. And just to let you know, we are already a little bit behind time, but we will, I'm sure, catch up throughout the morning. But I'll
whiz through this reasonably quickly. I'm not going to dig into the science too much, but as I go through the talk, you'll see things highlighted in orange. And what that means is that after the event, there'll be a PDF that will be circulated among all those who attend. And if you click on the orange bits, that's a link, that's a hyperlink that will take you to either to email me or other sources of information. So thanks again for taking the time to join us. The EU project True started in 2017. We're going to finish in September, and it's very difficult for me to tell you all in 10 minutes exactly what we've achieved in this time, but it's an amazing group of people, 24 partners, equal numbers of academic and non-academic. Here's some of us in Greece in 2018. But when you get the PDF of this talk, you can click on these links, and it will take you to the many outputs that we've generated. Essentially, we're 9 work packages, but excluding the ones on coordination and communication, we're work packages covering novel products, looking at market opportunities and barriers. We're looking at the environmental impact of legume-supported cropping systems, the economics, the policy, and also developing decision support tools. So I couldn't possibly cover all this in the time that we have, but do explore the website. We've been very open and very quick to put our outputs on the website. Here's just one example that may be of interest to some of you. It's a paper that we published just a few days ago, and on policy analysis, to identify those best routes to legume-based food and feed value chains. It still strikes me as quite amazing when I'm speaking to people around the world. While many might know of legumes, they don't really know yet what I would call their point of difference is. I'm sure most of the people here already know, but I feel it's a duty of all the legume scientists to make sure that folk do understand the fundamentals. They are an amazing group of plants. They form this symbiosis with rhizobia in the soil, and grown well, they need no synthetic mineral nitrogen fertilizer. Fantastic group of plants. And well managed can deliver tremendous benefits. Pollinators for beneficial insects. These could be biocontrol agents, reduce pesticide use. They improve soil qualities, the diversity of the soil function. The list goes on and on. For me, there's nothing not to like about a well-managed legume. So there's a tremendous irony, of course, in that most of the food and feed systems in Europe are legume supported, but they're not homegrown legume supported. And this is a picture that we have of Scotland, and it's about 1% of our arable ground cover in Scotland are peas and beans. I'm not going to talk about clover too much today. I'll leave that to other speakers who are coming late in the talk, but it's interesting we dig into these rotations, pea-based and bean-based rotations, but I could talk for a long time about the nature of the rotations for the bean-based and pea-based rotation, but they are different. And it's of great interest, but obviously we want to get up really to at least, I would say, 15% cover of grain legumes in the arable system. And here's another link to another paper that was published quite recently about the problems and opportunities that we have, particularly around grain legume production. Increasingly, we find that there's a big challenge beyond the farm gate. It's great to produce grain legumes, and here's just one example from faba bean. And faba beans can be tremendously valuable. Grown well, they'll be the most profitable crop in your rotation. But of course, the parts are worth more than the whole. And if you can have fractionation facilities, well, it's an air fractionation facility as shown in this picture here, or a wet fractionation facility, you can increase the value enormously. At the moment, hulls can go to cattle feed. The protein concentrate is in tremendous demand by aquaculture, but also increasingly human food markets. The starch concentrate traditionally would have went to pigs and poultry, but actually there's the price of the faba bean starch is just going up and up. But yet, if I look certainly to countries like Scotland, there's a challenge. The hulls are certainly inexpensive, but value can be added. We're seeing more and more projects using the hulls in products for human consumption, such as pasta. They have a high antioxidant value. They're good for gut health as well. And I've already mentioned the starch concentrate, but we do have a challenge. Certainly in Scotland, there are no dehulling facilities. There's a couple, a few now in England, and we don't have any major milling or air classification in the UK. So that stops us adding value. There are other ways, of course, to add value. We can breed, but again, breeding, there is no really major breeding effort, I would say, even in the UK. We select lines, we screen lines. So certainly at the James Hutton Institute, we have a fava bean collection, and we've been doing what we can with them. The 4 circled in there are high protein lines. So we're bulking some of those up. They've also been sent to Canada for breeding a little bit more. There's also been some participatory breeding from ex-staff, the retired staff. One of them in particular has developed this variety called the Scottish bean. It's a dwarf, very early, almost as early as a pea. So we're doing that at the moment, bulking that up too, and having a lot of fun making big products. This is worth mentioning. It's by a scientist based at the University of Warwick, Eric Holub, who's commercialized through Agri 3 different kinds of common bean. I'd like to get hold of some of these myself to see how they grow in Scotland, and maybe somebody would like to see how well they grow in Ireland too. But 2 different colours there, obviously a dark, a blonde, and a white bean. So that was another strand of success. There's a lot of innovation going on. Again, this is a soybean crop here. We've been testing them with different microbes. Here you see them planted as plots between barley because we don't want the different microbes that we're putting on each plot to travel between plots. But in short, we put on rhizobia, and we put on a buscular AMF, or buscular mycorrhiza fungi. And this is just dry biomass yields. We're looking at the potential of soybean as a whole crop forage in Scotland, but it grew very well, particularly, of course, when you added the microbes. And in 2018, we were lucky enough to get a grain yield. It wasn't a terrifically high grain yield by soybean standards, but you have to remember what the value of that yield is if it's routed to human food markets. And it really is quite a lucrative market if you can grow homegrown pulses or oleaginous crops such as soybean. They're really in quite high demand among the more discerning consumers. We're also looking at novel processing facilities, and here we've done what Scotland is very good at, which is distilling. We've made a neutral spirit with Arbiki, which is a particular short value chain where a farm has a distillery on the farm site. And here we've developed, we initially developed the pea-based spirit into a gin. It was extremely well received. It's been joined by a vodka now, and this particular farm had no legumes on the farm at all. These products, the Nadar products, are Nadar is an old Scots word for nature, and here they're now the best-selling products, and the farm now has 20% grain legume cover. We've also been brewing as well. And of course, although it's nice to have these lovely drinks, the real story is in the co-product, because the protein is dropping out in the co-product. So, and while they can be routed to feed, they're now being routed to food as well. So that's been well received by Lidl's, and we've even registered a trademark for that product. So we've had lots of fun, and they're great vehicles when we're speaking about legumes, because rather than engaging people and talking about greenhouse gases, it's great to engage people over a drink, a gin or a beer, and break into the heavy stuff about with regards to climate change and diffuse pollution further downstream. And again, here's another paper that you might like to look at that openly shares the methodology. It wasn't straightforward brewing and distilling with pulses. but the methods here to do that are openly shared. So I'm going to finish this pretty much my last slide. The Legume Innovation Network is hopefully going to go on after True ends. It ends this September. We've teamed up with another project, our sister project called Leg Value, and we're going to be launching a webinar series. So when you get this PDF, you can click on here to go to various internet sites where you find more information. But if you've enjoyed today, do join us for this series of webinars. True will be, and Leg Value will be replaced by the Legume Innovation Network, we hope. That's really just a hub. It's existing groups that work with legumes, but we hope it will be a place where they all meet. And it's particularly for business to facilitate knowledge exchange, innovation towards sustainable commercial development. And we're not exclusive. Anybody can join if you have an interest in legumes. So we'll have a website dedicated to that network. You can join freely. We have a LinkedIn group that's established, and we're hoping that you will keep an eye on that and join and take part in those conversations. We're also going to link to the International Legume Society, and that's more academic, but nevertheless a very interesting organisation, great bunch of people, and they have a biennial conference coming up which you might like to attend. It's in October 2022, and I hope by then COVID will have died down and we'll be able to travel and meet up in person. So get in touch if you'd like to talk to me and explore anything that I've mentioned today. I'd like to thank all my colleagues, tremendous bunch of people. We've got everything covering precision agriculture from legumes all the way through to marketing and consumer studies. So that's it from me. I'll stop sharing my screen now, and I hope you enjoyed that brief presentation.
Thank you very much, Pete. Some excellent examples there of adding value to the raw products, particularly like the beer and the gin ones there. Maybe when we all get together, we could bring a few samples with you the next time around. Thanks again, Pete. What we're going to do now is we're just going to show a short video of a farmer called Michael Gowan, who's a dairy farmer, and he discusses using Clover on his pasture-based dairy farm.
The reason I chose to incorporate Clover here was because I think it's only a matter of time before we're going to be forced into less nitrogen fertilizer use. So the follow on from that is that we're going to grow less grass, and quality of the grass in mid-season is going to reduce. So that will have a negative impact on the finances of the farm. So what I'm hoping to do is to incorporate Clover into the farm to fix the nitrogen, and by fixing nitrogen for the grass is going to replace artificial nitrogen, and the silver lining on that is will also reduce my fertilizer costs for the year. The advice I'd give to farmers would be, I suppose, first of all, to get the soil fertility correct, get the pHs up to 6.4 and 6.5 and so on, and to get the P and K indexes up to 3 and 4. After that, it's about establishing the clover in the sward, either by reseeding or oversowing. Reseeding is probably the best and most reliable way of doing it, but it can be very slow. It could take a good number of years to do it. So some form of oversowing should be incorporated into it. After that, it's about educating yourself as to how to manage the clover afterwards. I suppose the best advice I could give to anybody would be to learn from others that are already gone down that road. The challenges I've faced, there aren't too many of them. One challenge would be that over the next couple of years I'm going to have grass-only swards and grass clover swards, so I'm going to have two management strategies for each. There's going to be a challenge with oversowing. It's a little bit hit and miss. To be honest, the biggest challenge I faced was in my own headspace, in trying to convince myself that, first of all, that it was the right thing to do, and secondly, that I would have confidence in my own ability to manage the thing afterwards. I think that there are enough templates out there in terms of research farms and commercial farms that have already made a success of this, and from now on I intend to follow what's going on in those farms. Well, I'm very early in the journey, but at the moment I'm confident that I can make a success of it.
Okay, and thanks to Michael for that video, giving us really practical advice and his own experience of managing clover on his farm. So our next speaker, I'm delighted to introduce to you, is Bob Rees, who is a professor in agriculture and climate change at SRUC, Scotland's Rural College. His research interests are in carbon sequestration, agricultural greenhouse gas mitigation and adaptation, and he has authored and co-authored over 150 research papers. Today, he will discuss the UK's ambition to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions, and will consider the role of legumes and how they can be most effectively incorporated into farming systems to achieve net zero policy targets. Good morning, Bob. How are you today?
Good morning, Mark, and thanks for that kind introduction.
Yeah, you're very welcome to here today. Bob, we'll ask you to share your screen with us. I'm really looking forward to your presentation because, of course, greenhouse gas emissions is a major topic for certainly here in Ireland and across Europe and agriculture globally. So really interested in your views on the role of legumes.
Great, okay, thank you. So I'll share my screen. Hope you can see that.
That's great. And just a reminder to everybody that please do send us your questions using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we'll have a chance at the end of Bob's presentation to answer some of those questions, or indeed if you have questions for James or Pete who have already spoken. So Bob, I hand over to you now. Thanks.
So thanks, Mark, and good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to join you for this Legume Innovation Network meeting. I think you've chosen a really interesting and timely topic. And I was asked to talk about the role of legumes in terms of greenhouse gas mitigation, which I think is a really interesting topic. So the UK has set some of the world's most ambitious targets for greenhouse gas mitigation. And these are legally binding targets that we have to meet by 2050, achieving net zero emissions by that time. But I think one of the things that's maybe less understood is the importance and the role of the agriculture and land use sector in meeting those targets. Now, James showed some slides a little earlier to show that the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture in the UK are actually quite a small proportion of the overall total, and that's true. But the role that the land use sector will have to play in offsetting the energy requirements for the UK's decarbonisation programme are very significant, and agriculture and land use together will play a crucially important role in this decarbonisation. But I want to focus today specifically on the role that legumes will play in this. So let's start by looking at the big picture, go back 6 years to the Paris Climate Change Agreement. This was a landmark agreement that really changed the direction and urgency of tackling the issue of climate change, with an aspiration at the time to limit global temperature rises to no more than 2 degrees centigrade, with an ambition to limit rises to 1.5 degrees centigrade. The science is moving on rapidly, and since Paris, there are multiple lines of evidence demonstrating significantly increased risks globally of temperature rises of 2 degrees centigrade, and policymakers and IPCC are now convinced that a limit to global warming of no more than 1.5 degrees C should be the target. So that has big implications. This schematic diagram represents the pathway to a 1.5 degrees centigrade world. And there are some stark messages in this diagram. We've been increasing our global greenhouse gas emissions for over a century. And this diagram, which shows the timeline over the rest of this century, tells us that we need almost immediately to start reversing that increase and reducing global emissions. The big black line across the center of the diagram represents the net greenhouse gas emissions globally. So these need to start coming down very rapidly. By the middle of the century, they need to come down to zero, and then in the second part of the century, they need to go below zero net greenhouse gas emissions. But the other thing that's really interesting here is the role of the land use sector. So the brown shaded area here represents the land use sector. Now the net emissions from the land use sector are actually positive at the moment because of things like deforestation and agricultural emissions. But these need to become negative in a few decades' time, removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So we need to push down the emissions from the agriculture sector and use land use change to remove greenhouse gas emissions. But there's another interesting part of this diagram, this yellow section here, which is also part of the land use sector. It's the greenhouse gas removals. So we're going to have to pull greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere in order to meet our net zero targets. And this is a new concept. There was an idea recently that we could achieve the climate change mitigation that we needed, or climate change targets that we needed through mitigation. But it's now clear that mitigation alone is not going to be enough. It's not enough just to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We've got so much greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that we actually physically need to pull them out of the atmosphere in order to avoid dangerous climate change. So this so-called greenhouse gas removals technology, biomass energy, carbon capture and storage, for example, will be necessary in order to avoid that dangerous climate change. So this has influenced UK policy development. The UK has accepted this requirement to to abide by the 1.5 degrees C limit to temperature rises, and agreed to a net zero target by 2050, which would end the UK's contribution to warming of the global climate within the next 30 years. And if that were replicated worldwide, it would give us a 50-50 chance of actually not exceeding the 1.5 degrees centigrade target. So it's not maybe a great opportunity, but that's where we are. But the policy framework recognizes specific nature of agriculture and land use, and that they're different to other sectors of the economy that are emitting greenhouse gases. So for a start, the greenhouse gases that come out of agriculture are a result of biological processes. Almost everywhere else in the economy, greenhouse gases are a result of industrial or mechanical processes. We're looking at non-CO2 greenhouse gases in the agriculture sector, whereas in most other places it's fossil fuel consumption and CO2 generation that's responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. In the agriculture and land use sector, we're looking at both emissions and uptake of greenhouse gases, so that's different again from other sectors. We've got the issue that food production is a basic human need. We simply can't shut down the agriculture sector. We've got to keep this going. There are wider socioeconomic implications of changing the ways in which we produce food. And historically, there's been a lot of inertia in the agriculture sector to changes. So there are some big challenges here when we think about the ways in which the agriculture and land use sector are going to respond to this policy challenge of getting to net zero. And here is the challenge. So on the left-hand side of this diagram, this is the UK's total greenhouse gas emissions in 2019, producing just under 500 million tonnes of CO2 equivalents per year. By 2050, we've got to get that down to zero or net zero. So any remaining emissions will need to be offset by removals at that time. So in the middle panel, you see that all the sectors, apart from agriculture, are represented there. So all of the sectors, such as power generation, buildings, industry, and so on, will need to bring their emissions close to zero. There'll be a small residual amount that can be offset by carbon removals. But on the right-hand panel, you see two rather exceptional sectors, and those are aviation and agriculture. And these are the two really difficult ones. These are the ones that are most difficult to bring down to zero. Aviation, for obvious reasons, difficult, although we seem to have managed that in the past year or so. We've closed down the aviation industry. Agriculture, even more difficult. Agriculture has got targets to reduce its emissions, but it's accepted because of those constraints I've just mentioned, that there's going to be a significant residual emission from agriculture by 2050, and that's going to have to be offset by other removals, some of which haven't even yet been identified. So this is the mitigation pathway for agriculture. It identifies a number of contributions to this pathway. So the shaded areas at the top of this diagram represent reductions in emissions. The overall total, the 50 million tonnes that we start with, is still going to be significant by 2050 because we've got this residual emission. But we're going to make changes to farming practices that take about 5 million tonnes out of the system. And interestingly, also, there can be dietary change. Dietary change is being modelled as being more of a significant contribution to reductions in emissions over this period than low carbon farming practices. But I think one of the interesting things from the perspective of the legume discussion today is that legumes are likely to contribute both to dietary change and to low carbon farming practices. Now, one of the challenges we have with the agriculture sector is this issue of inertia. So this graph shows you the trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions since 1990, the start of the Kyoto Protocol. And there has been some significant decarbonisation in the UK over this period. Industry and power generation have brought down emissions quite significantly to lower the overall total greenhouse gas emissions. So these lines at the top show significant reductions in emissions through decarbonisation. But there are several sectors that are showing rather little change, and agriculture is one of them. At the past 10 years, there's been almost no change in emissions from the agriculture sector. Despite initiatives and incentives to try to do so, agricultural emissions have remained static. And this isn't a situation that can continue, because as other sectors decarbonise, the agriculture sector occupies more and more of the space that's available for carbon emissions in the economy overall, and there's going to be increasing pressure on agriculture to reduce its emissions. So what role do legumes have in contributing to this emission reduction in the agriculture sector? Well, I think the first thing to say, and Pete sort of covered this, is that legumes appear in all sorts of places in our agricultural systems. Certainly they're important as forage crops, but we also use them as intercrops in arable and mixed farming systems. We use them as cover crops. We have main arable crops, and we use them in rotational systems. And understanding this matrix of use of legumes in farming systems is really critical to understanding how they're going to contribute to climate change mitigation. So one of our students in the TRUE project, Marcella, has been looking at the role of legumes in rotational systems and their contribution to the nitrogen economy. And I'm not even going to attempt to try to explain this diagram in any detail, but what it shows is how a legume placed in one position within a rotation influences nitrogen and greenhouse gas emissions at other points in the rotation. So we basically have 3 blocks of a rotation, or 3 years of a rotation in this diagram. You have a legume growing here at the left-hand side, fixing nitrogen, adding nitrogen to the soil, which is then transferred through the rotation into a subsequent crop in the subsequent year. It's contributing to the nitrogen economy of that crop, and even to the nitrogen economy of a crop that follows it. And this study has attempted to capture these interactions and transformations, which I think have been neglected in previous analyses of cropping systems, but are critically important in understanding the fertilizer balance and fertilizer inputs that are required to contribute to farming systems overall, and not just individual years within a rotation. And of course, influencing the nitrogen economy is one of the really critical things that legumes are able to contribute to in our farming systems. Now, again, apologies for this slide because it's a little bit complex, But right at the center here, so this is a summary of nitrogen flows across the European continent. It's a study of where all the nitrogen goes and what it's used for. And right at the center of the diagram, we have fertilizers, which are driving our agricultural production systems. They're used to produce crops, and the crops are used to produce livestock, and so on. So we use 11.2 teragrams of fertilizer nitrogen to drive these agricultural production systems. But if you look carefully, you'll see a small line there, and the thickness of the line is proportional to the amount of nitrogen in the system. A small line representing biological nitrogen fixation by legumes. And this is providing 1 teragram of nitrogen to our production systems. So it's a relatively small input. And this is a transformation in the way in which we've organized our agriculture. 100 years ago, there was no industrial fixation of nitrogen. All of the nitrogen that drove our production systems came from legumes. This has been flipped around. We now depend very heavily on fertilizer nitrogen. So the question is, can we reverse this to some extent, or can we change this balance? And I think there's a lot of interest in doing that now. And why are we interested in doing that? Well, it's because of the environmental damage that's caused by the use of nitrogen fertilizers. So this graphic here shows you how nitrogen fertilizers have a direct relationship with the greenhouse gas emission nitrous oxide. So this is a study that looked at 5 different grassland sites across the UK and applied different rates of nitrogen fertilizer to those grasslands. So these graphs at the bottom show varying rates of ammonium nitrogen fertilizer input to the grassland and the response in terms of the nitrous oxide emission that is released from those grasslands. And the thing that you see is that there are some site differences, certainly, between the different sites in terms of the magnitude of emissions, but consistently across all the sites, you see a very significant increase in nitrous oxide emissions in response to increasing rates of fertilizer use. And some of those emissions are very high. We're seeing in some circumstances more than 10 kilograms of nitrous oxide emitted per hectare per year from these grasslands. And if you bear in mind that nitrous oxide has a warming potential of almost 300 times greater than carbon dioxide, you can appreciate that those emissions are very high. We're looking at the almost equivalent of a ton per kilogram of ton of carbon per kilogram of nitrous oxide emitted equivalent. So if that's the case, and if the nitrogen inputs coming from our fertilizers are causing this amount of damage, what is the opportunity for legumes? So legumes are difficult things to work with in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and the studies in legumes are not as prevalent as those from other cereal crops. But putting together some of the work that has been done, this analysis by Mark Gibson in 2013 looked at greenhouse gas emissions over a year from a range of different legume crops and saw very much lower emissions than you would expect from fertilized cereal grassland systems. So the mean across all of these sites was just over 1 kilogram of nitrous oxide per hectare per year. If you compare that with some of those numbers I was showing in the previous slide of almost 10 kilograms per hectare, you'll see that this is a very significant reduction. And one of the issues then is, well, okay, there may be benefits in terms of using legumes in rotational systems, but what are the costs to a farmer? So we've done some work for Scottish Government looking at mitigation opportunities for different interventions in farming systems to try to help government meet their policy targets. And this graph shows a whole range of interventions that we can make in farming systems, from precision nitrogen use to optimal pH to inhibitors and crop varieties, and compares the amount of carbon that can be mitigated, that's the dark green line, by these interventions. And this study looked at including grain legumes in arable rotations, and came to the conclusion that actually the mitigation potential, the carbon savings that we could achieve from this are probably greater than any of the other interventions that we could envisage. Now, there are costs to the farmer of doing this, and this is one of the barriers. But interestingly, in the analysis of policy options that the Committee on Climate Change have just recently published, they're estimating that the cost of decarbonising agriculture is going to be somewhere around £3.5 billion per year by 2035. So that sort of money is going to have to go into the agriculture sector to support this decarbonisation. And as we look to sort of realign the way in which we use subsidies in agriculture, these sorts of costs are the sorts of things that are likely to be paid for in these renewed policy proposals. We've already heard about legume-based pastures as well, and I think these are going to play another critical role in helping to decarbonise the agriculture system. So increasing grass clover increasing grass clover in swards will decrease the use of nitrogen fertiliser, and that reduces nitrous oxide emissions in two ways. Firstly, it reduces the emissions that are associated with the fertiliser application to the soil, but there's also a saving in terms of the fertiliser manufacture, because we don't see that sometimes represented in the agricultural emission, because this is an industrial emission, but the manufacture of the fertiliser product itself is associated with carbon cost, which can be saved by using clover in grass swards. And we've been looking at evidence for the changing fluxes of nitrous oxide emissions from grass clover swards. You see that in various ways. So the horizontal axis here represents the proportion of clover in a grass sward, and the top diagram represents the amount of nitrous oxide emission. So you see when you have low proportions of clover, the nitrous oxide emissions tend to be higher, and that's reflected by the fact that those low clover swards tend to have higher fertilizer applications, fertilizer nitrogen applications, so they're associated with higher emissions. What's maybe interesting here is that even when you get to zero fertilizer application or 100% clover in a sward, you still have nitrous oxide emissions. And that's because nitrous oxide is emitted from legume-based systems, and we think that a lot of that probably comes from the crop residues. So there's an assumption that the emission factor for the nitrogen input from legume-based systems is close to zero. We don't get an emission associated with the input of nitrogen, but once that nitrogen is fixed and moved into plant material in the legume, and then maybe incorporated or transferred into the soil, that crop residue will emit a nitrous oxide emission as it decomposes and transforms nitrogen within the soil. But I think one thing I would say about crop residue contribution is that this is one of the most uncertain parts of the greenhouse gas inventory in agricultural systems. And we're working on a project at the moment to try to improve our estimates of these emissions and look at possible mitigation options for developing systems that have a tighter recycling of nitrogen from the residues that are produced both by legumes and other crops. And what we are able to show is that by replacing clover in grass swards, or replacing grass by clover in swards, we are able to reduce the nitrous oxide emissions as you increase the amount of clover. But there's a trade-off, because there's a yield penalty for increasing clover contributions. So it seems like the intermediate situation where you have a mixture of grass and clover avoids some of the worst yield penalties, but still achieve significant nitrous oxide mitigation. So if we're going to think about mitigation and replacing forage crops with legumes, legumes in arable rotations, What sort of contribution can it make to our net zero targets? What are the reduced fertilizer inputs that could be achieved? How much can we reduce nitrous oxide emissions, and how much would it influence soil carbon sequestration? So we've done a modeling exercise to look at this, and we've used a farm-based carbon calculator called AgriCalc to look at a sequence of mitigation actions that will reduce emissions on a real farm. And one of the things I said earlier is that farming is never going to get to zero completely. There's always going to be a residual emission. We need to know what that residual emission is in order to understand what the size of the offsetting is going to be when we get to 2050. So what we did was we took what is a typical farm in the south of Scotland and introduced a whole series of mitigation measures, which included the use of legumes in the farming system. So this farm it was actually a hypothetical farm. It had 300 hectares of land. It was a mixed farming enterprise, had livestock and cereal production plus some pastures. So we chose a series of interventions that have shown to be most promising in the reviews of mitigation options that we've done for government. And these included improving and sticking to recommended nitrogen fertilizer applications, improving productivity in the livestock system, using inhibitors for methane production, incorporating legumes into the rotation and other things. And I haven't got time to go into a lot of the detail here, but one of the interesting things about the legumes is that they brought the emissions down more significantly than most of the other mitigation options that we were looking at. Once all those mitigation options have been applied, then we're left with the residual. So we removed some of that by afforestation. Afforestation could only get us so far, so the remaining residual we removed by biochar. And at this point, at the end of the sequence, we actually get to a net zero farm. The farm is not emitting any carbon emissions, and legumes have made a significant contribution to that. So I think one of the things that this highlights is that we need to develop a holistic account of the role of legumes, both in terms of direct and indirect impacts in the farming systems. And there's still lots of things we don't know. I've been sort of telling you a lot of things we do know, but there are lots of things like emissions from crop residues that we're uncertain about, contributions to carbon sequestration, and wider impacts on microbial communities. And I'll just finish off by a couple of brief snapshots of some things that we've been doing recently to sort of highlight some of these intriguing uncertainties about legumes and how there's more that we need to find out. So we know, for instance, that different legume cultivars actually have a very different impact on nitrous oxide emissions. These are nitrous oxide emissions from different cultivars of pea, and they vary very significantly between varieties. And the reason behind that is still not fully understood. We've also been doing some work with the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Science recently on the microbial impacts of legumes in farming systems, and come up with some intriguing results about the role of legumes used as cover crops, which are incorporated into the soil, and the impacts that they have on nitrification activity. So nitrification is one of the sort of key nitrogen transformations in soils. It actually releases nitrous oxide. So it's this issue about crop residue management. And it seems that some of the legume-based treatments that we were using had a significant impact on reducing this nitrification rate that we don't fully understand, but it's a new and intriguing observation. And not only do legumes influence the nitrogen economy of soils, but we've been showing through these studies that there's impacts on the carbon economy. So in rice-based systems, these legumes, incorporation of legumes together with rice straw was having a significant effect in reducing methane emissions from these soils. So having a really different impact on the overall carbon budget of the system. And I started with the big picture, so I'll end with the big picture. And this is a view of the global nitrogen cycle. So at the moment, we use about 180 teragrams of nitrogen to drive our agricultural systems, food production systems around the world. And that's divided between about 120 teragrams of fertilizer nitrogen and 60 teragrams of nitrogen provided by biological fixation. So biological fixation still makes a significant contribution. But one of the problems with nitrogen is that we've reached or passed the planetary threshold for sustainable nitrogen use. The planetary boundary for nitrogen use is significantly exceeded. And yet the projections are, for the way in which we have been using nitrogen recently, that there's going to be further increases in nitrogen use to support food production, with fertilizer production going to 160 teragrams and agricultural nitrogen, biological nitrogen fixation going to 79. Those are difficult numbers for the planet to cope with. I think there are two things we need to think about. One is restricting how much extra nitrogen we add to the planetary system, and the other is increasing the proportion of that nitrogen that is supplied by biological nitrogen fixation. So my concluding thoughts are that the pathway to net zero will require deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions across all sectors, but have very significant impacts for the land use sector. And I haven't talked about the energy issues, but there's very strong links there. I think legumes offer a really vitally important contribution to this mitigation and have many co-benefits that we still need to explore. And these wider benefits will offer opportunities not only to address things like the nitrogen problem, but things like the biodiversity issue and the wider environmental impacts of farming systems. So I'd like to finish there, acknowledge a whole range of sources of funding, particularly the TRUE project, and welcome you all to the COP26 meeting later this year in Glasgow, at which all these issues will no doubt be discussed in further detail, and to which we hope to make a contribution. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Bob, for really good overview of where things are at in relation to greenhouse gases. And I think a topic that probably hasn't been discussed enough is the whole sequestration side of things, and how we need to actually be removing carbon from the atmosphere. I'm just going to introduce my colleague Andy Boland, who is an environment specialist with Teagasc, who has agreed to help us out with questions coming through from our audience today. So we do have questions coming through, so thanks to everybody who has submitted questions so far. And please do keep the questions flowing if you have questions for Bob, or indeed for Pete or for James. And if you wouldn't mind indicating who your question is for as well. Just a reminder as well that today we hope to wrap up the seminar this morning at 12:15, so that we'll have plenty of time for questions, and we will be having a panel discussion before that. So Andy, some interesting questions coming through there for Bob in particular.
Yeah, a few, Mark, coming through. Bob, one in relation to the dietary change and food waste change that's expected. It's huge. Like, yet the time frame is small. Is this realistic? In other words, the expectation is big, but the time frame is small.
It's interesting. I mean, so the Committee on Climate Change is a body that's been set up to advise government on meeting their policy targets. And I think one of the things that's perhaps been rather hidden from the public is the importance that's attached to dietary change in terms of meeting targets. And I think, you know, it's almost inevitable. We've worked, many colleagues have worked on greenhouse gas mitigation for decades, and it really is just very difficult to get mitigation in the agriculture sector. There are so many constraints. So, I mean, if we're, and agricultural mitigation is about supply side changes to the system. So if you can't get those supply side changes, the only thing you're left with is demand side. So the question is, can we keep demanding these high carbon products if there isn't the mitigation potential there in the system to deliver the supply side changes? And I think it's a recognition of that inevitability, really. And you know, a few years ago, people were very pessimistic about any opportunity to change dietary preference. But actually what you're seeing at the moment are quite significant shifts in dietary intake of food products. we are seeing a reduction in meat and dairy consumption in the UK, and there are all sorts of reasons for that. But actually, given the changes that have taken place in the past 5 years, the projected changes over the next 30 years don't look so ambitious.
Okay. And another one, Bob, is there an advantage in the CO2 emission in the production of grain legumes? Say in comparison to grain production or in comparison to the import of grain legumes?
Yeah, so the grain legumes have a much lower carbon footprint than conventional grain crops, so your wheat and barley. So it's this difference in fertilizer requirement that the grain legumes have from conventional crops. So by growing grain legumes, we're avoiding that fertilizer input. So that's the big difference, is not only the emissions that come from the soil, it's also the emissions associated with fertilizer manufacture. But I suppose the other difference that we can make is by growing grain legumes, we're changing the protein economy. So our protein economy in Europe is very much based on a model that assumes an import of protein from South America through soya imports. If we can switch that to homegrown protein supplies, we're avoiding those emissions that are produced in South America, which actually don't appear on our balance sheet in the UK or Europe, because those are associated with deforestation and are allocated to other countries. But in terms of helping global emissions, that makes a big change.
Okay. And another one, Bob, about does Clover improve, obviously, the quality of forage and animal output sufficiently to offset the yield penalty? In the bulk of the yield of forage, it's not the whole story. So there's obviously an interaction between the quality of the forage and animal output.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably other people in the audience who are better placed to answer that question than me, because I'm not an animal nutritionist. I mean, so certainly there are issues associated with very high levels of clover in forage, and you would want to balance that out against other components of the diet, I guess. But again,
yeah, I mean, off the top of my head, there was work we were doing with lambs and that in Teagasc, and that showed improved carcass weight and that, and in milk production, improved milk solids and things like that. There's another one as well. I'd say, Bob, this maybe James or someone else might like to come in on this. Will you have increased N2O losses in a grass clover sward on a poorly draining soil when compared to a moderate or freely drained soil?
Yeah, so I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, one of the things you probably want to try to do if you were growing clover in a sort of farm environment is try to improve your drainage, because clover is a little bit sensitive to wet soils. And wet soils will certainly increase the nitrous oxide emission, but they would increase it less in a clover sward than they would in a grass sward, because you don't have that response to the fertilizer input. One of the reasons you get a lower emission of nitrous oxide from clover swards is that the nitrogen input is very gradual and continuous over a long period of time. So you don't get the big peaks in nitrogen concentration in the soil that you get in response to fertilizer inputs. When you're adding a fertilizer, you may be adding 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare at a time. And that big pulse of nitrogen is the thing that the nitrifying and denitrifying organisms in the soil are responding to and producing these big fluxes of nitrous oxide. And we see that in the data when you apply nitrogen fertilizer, the response can be very rapid and very peaky. So the answer is yes, wet soils will increase the nitrous oxide emission, regardless of whether it's a clover or a conventional grassland system, but the increase would be greater in a conventional grassland system.
Yeah. On one of your slides there, Bob, you spoke about the mitigation, and you had a cost associated with that. in terms of greenhouse gas, but in terms of Clover, what elements, how is that cost broken down? Or, you know, you had the graph.
Yeah, so actually that was for legumes in an arable rotation. So that was putting legumes in a sort of system where you'd have continuous cereals probably as an alternative. So the costs are due to the reduced gross margins that you would get from doing that. I mean, one of the things that drives farmers not to use legumes are costs. I mean, and that's fairly straightforward, and it's inevitably the case. So what we've got to look at is how can we offset those costs? I mean, if we need to pay farmers the difference between the cost of including a legume in the rotation and not doing so, then that would be a legitimate cost, because the costs per unit of carbon saved are quite low. And the other thing to say is that actually I think the analyses that we've done recently suggest that if you do the full accounting and look for this rotational transfer of nitrogen between parts of the rotation, the costs are a lot less than they might have appeared otherwise. So the fact that you get nitrogen transferred from a legume to a subsequent crop, and that can help to reduce your nitrogen fertilizer application to subsequent crop, offsets the cost of that legume in the first place.
Okay, we've another one. Given the emerging science on methane, isn't climate neutrality a more realistic and appropriate objective for the agriculture sector rather than net zero? Under the concept of climate neutrality, it will not be necessary to balance all residual methane emissions.
Well, I think, yeah, so methane is another story. We have to be careful about methane. Methane behaves very differently to the CO2 and nitrous oxide, and there's a lot of debate going on about the way in which we do the accounting for methane at the moment in the scientific community. I mean, I think things are going to change. We're going to look at methane differently because it's a short-lived greenhouse gas as opposed to nitrous oxide and CO2, which are long-lived greenhouse gases. But it does mean that there will be increased sensitivity to changes in methane. If we reduce the methane emissions from our farming systems, it'll give a big benefit. But if the emissions are increased, then there'll be a big short-term detriment in terms of emissions. But in terms of neutrality, you know, I think I've talked about net zero. I think we're probably, the policy is going to move on beyond this, and we're going to have to go to net negative in the second part of this century. So the policy targets will keep getting stronger.
Okay. Okay. It was interesting. One question or slide you had as well, Bob, it came up in the questions was, you know, the difference between the biological process and the industrial process in relation to greenhouse gases. And, you know, I think there's a lot of education going on at the moment about greenhouse gas in inverted commas, but it's all, you know, chubbed in together. And I think, so, you know, is there a role there for an education process with relation to, you know, the more biological processes relating to greenhouse gases and even the general public and how they're educated about food and all the rest of it, where it all seems to be chumped in together at the moment?
Absolutely, and I think the biology is going to play a crucial role in our decarbonisation. As I say, I mean, there's huge optimism in the use of bioenergy in the economy in order to solve our climate change problems. So the bioenergy isn't just going to be producing energy, but it's going to be used as a carbon removal technology to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. And people have been looking for machines to do this for years, for centuries. But in fact, we've got the perfect machines. They're called trees. They're perfectly efficient at taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. And all we need to do is harvest the material they produce and make sure that that CO2 isn't returned. And there are two ways of doing that. We can either capture the carbon and store it underground, or we can convert it into biochar and store it in soils. So these are a whole new approaches to farming and landscape management that will be crucially dependent on biology. And I think, you know, I think you're right, there's a lot of education to go on here, because a lot of people think of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change as being all about fossil fuel consumption. And obviously that's an important contributor, but the biology, the land use, farming systems are really important.
Just one final one, Bob. We're getting close to time. I say, Mark, you're probably wanting to pull the plug on it, but it's relating to the residue of N by legumes. It says, what proportion of the residue of N is left in grassland soil after a growing season? And it goes on to ask here about the nitrogen use efficiency is only about 25% utilized, and it's the issue with water quality. So really, I suppose, what's the residue left in grassland, or have we any idea of that?
Yeah, I mean, so residue input from grasslands is a very difficult thing to measure because residues are being continuously added to the soil. But I mean, there is a large input of residues. I mean, it's equivalent to a significant fraction of the above ground biomass production that's going into the soil. And of course, that's critical in terms of maintaining soil organic matter and soil fertility. But it also plays a role in these emissions. And one of the things we're struggling with at the moment is to separate out what you'd call a sort of natural background emission from an emission that comes from adding these residues. And that's the difficult thing to do.
Okay.
Okay.
I think, Mark, that's all of them buttoned up.
Yes, thank you, Andy, and Bob. Thanks again for excellent presentation. And just to let everybody know that a copy of Bob's presentation and all of the other presentations from today will be available on the Teagasc website after today, and also the True website. And we're also recording today's webinar, so we will make a recording available afterwards on YouTube. Before our next speaker, Elaine Levy, who is an organic specialist from Teagasc, we're going to just show you a short clip here of a video of James Humphreys speaking about the work that's taking place in Salahead, which is a research farm managed by Teagasc, and this farm is focused on, I suppose, reducing nitrogen inputs and greenhouse gas emissions. So we'll just hand over to James on this video for a few updates on what's happening in Salahead.
Following rapid expansion, there's an immense challenge to lower the environmental impact of dairy farming. Here at Salahead Research Farm, we've designed and tested systems for lowering the carbon and ammonia footprints of milk production. Our focus has been on minimising fertilizer nitrogen input and maximising nitrogen use efficiency to lower nitrous oxide and ammonia emissions. Nitrous oxide, as you probably know, is a very potent greenhouse gas, and it accounts for around 35% of emissions from farms. Maintaining optimum soil fertility is important, particularly soil lime status. We use a trailing shoe for low emission slurry application, and slurry is applied primarily in the spring. Biological nitrogen fixation by white and red clover is key to the system here because there are little or no nitrous oxide emissions or ammonia emissions associated with it. Where it is necessary to apply nitrogen fertilizer, it is applied solely as protected urea. Using these practices, we've been able to maintain pasture production and milk output from our farm. We've been able to lower the carbon footprint of milk production produced here by up to 35% compared with the national average. Likewise, we've been able to lower ammonia footprint by 45%. These management practices can be immediately adopted by farmers, which is important because there's an urgency in tackling these issues, particularly climate change and water quality. This work is aligned with the EU and national policy to lower nitrogen fertilizer use in accordance with the Green Deal. It's also very important for the image of our products and the marketing of our products, which will be increasingly important in the future.
Thank you to James for that excellent overview of what's happening in Salahead. Really important work going on there in relation to reducing the overall footprint of agriculture. Okay, we're going to move on to the next part of today's proceedings, and we're going to be joined now by Elaine Levy. And Elaine is an organic extension specialist with Teagasc, providing advice and training to farmers nationally. And she will discuss the prospects for organic agriculture in Ireland. As we know, legumes are a key component of organic grassland cropping systems here in Ireland. So Elaine, good morning to you. How are you today?
Good morning, Mark. Not a bother. Thank you very much. And good morning to you all.
Great.
I will will I share my screen, Mark?
Yes, please do. Yes, that would be great. And really looking forward to your presentation, Elaine. Again, if you have questions for Elaine this morning, please do just put Elaine's name in front of the question when you're submitting your question, or indeed for any of the other speakers throughout the morning. We will be pulling together all of our speakers later on together in a panel. So Elaine, we'll hand over to you, and look, we will talk to you afterwards.
Okay, Mark. Everybody can see my screen, Mark. Everything okay there?
Yes, that looks perfect.
Okay, good morning, everybody. As Mark said, I work in the area of organics as an organic KT specialist. So I'm very much, as somebody described me, boots on the ground, working with farmers at farm level in all aspects of deciding whether to convert to organics, or indeed farmers that are farming organically on good farming practices. So what I would like to do this morning is, I want to start by giving you an outline of what the organic production in Ireland is at, so where we are at as regards organic production. And from there, I'm going to move into what are the opportunities, and I'm going to focus in on, for what the talk is about, where legumes fit into the opportunities for organic production, and then where does policy align with this going forward in the future in the big picture style and here in Ireland, and then kind of bring it all together in a number of summary points. If we just take a look first, exactly what is the organic land area in Ireland? The total land area being farmed in Ireland represents 2% of the agricultural area of the land. So that's in the total on all enterprises. That equates to about 74,000 hectares. This in comparison to the EU average, which is at 7.5%, and I think is in the region of 13.4 million hectares. But coming back to Ireland, I want to take a look at now is what this 2%, the breakdown as regards what enterprises are at farm level as regards Irish organic production. And we have a chart here, and I have all the enterprises represented on it and giving you numbers in relation to what the breakdown is. So as you can see, starting here on the left, cattle enterprises, there's in around 1,400 farmers, and those with sheep is at 739, over 240 horticulture units, 134 cereal farmers, 172 poultry farms, including meat and eggs, and in the region of 62 organic dairy herds. So what jumps out from there for those of you who are watching is that most of Irish organic production, organic farmers produce livestock. So that is the main area of production. So therefore, we have a lot of grassland area in the system. I just maybe preface this also with that this number, you're equating this there's been about a 40% increase in Ireland of organic farmers since 2014. So altogether, we've in the region of 1,900 organic producers. So where I want to go on to now is I want to lead into as regards where legumes come in relation to, and we're talking about legumes in our, when I'm talking to farmers on a day-to-day basis, legumes that we're talking about are red clover and white clover are the main ones we talk about, and maybe to a certain extent where we have arable situations where we have pulses being grown in cooperation. For example, we have a good lot of interest at farm level at the moment of combi crops, where along with a cereal crop, farmers are beginning to look at maybe growing a pea in with that combi crop. At the moment, I want to say that we did some work looking at what the supply is as regards cereal production versus the demand, and what kind of a gap is presently there within the system. And as you can see, in 2018, we looked at that there was 2,000, those 161 farmers equate to about 2,000, just over 2,000 hectares of cereals. And we averaged them at producing 3.5 tonne per hectare. So in the system is approximately 7,500 tonnes of cereals being produced. We looked at the demand with the various enterprises in relation to, for example, for pig, for poultry, sheep, dairy, beef, and for the porridge flour market. And we estimated that demand would be in the region of 7,500 hectares, producing in 26,000 tonnes. So That is what the supply is and what the demand. So just in relation to, just to actually summarize this, is that there's a requirement there, a demand there of 3.5 times, apologies, 3.5 times of what is being produced. So the demand is at 26,000. So that is where the summary from that we can take. So why am I saying, when you're growing cereals, we all know that, and Bob was talking about rotation in organics and in organic farming. When we're talking to farmers, we're talking about building up a rotation. So in a cereal enterprise where you're growing cereals, you will have a rotation, and part of that rotation we will be talking on farm is a clover fertility building phase in that rotation. So legumes in the form of red clover will be very, very important and very significant. So if we can, there is an opportunity there to be more self-sufficient, because that is one of the challenges for farmers when converting to organics, is the access to protein and on-farm feed in that form, because we have so much grassland. So if we could be more self-sufficient by growing more organic cereals and pulses, that would have a knock-on effect then, that requires then more protein legume crops to be also grown in that rotation. So you're talking about, you have a requirement there that there is a demand and a role and a real need and an opportunity for legumes to be included in the rotation. In doing that, what we're going to be doing then is we're going to, number one, we're going to be producing a quality feed and protein for all our organic livestock sectors, which are down here below, such as the sheep, cattle, and dairying enterprises. So that is a real opportunity there in relation to legumes going forward. If we then take a look at, as regards policy, where does that policy align? We've been hearing a lot, and farmers are hearing a lot in the last 18 months, the whole idea, the Green Deal and the farm to fork. And big overview from the European level is that they want to increase organic farming to an extent of, there's been talk in the region of 25% of all Europe to be farming organically, land area be farmed organically by 2030. So there's a real push in relation to big picture overview from a European point of view. From our own point of view here in Ireland, we have a 7-year government strategy plan in relation to the sector, and an overall aim is to increase the sector driven by market demand. There is targets within all the main sectors within this plan. Just to say, in relation to our own government, and this week alone, a new organic farming scheme has been launched for new entrants to enter an organic farming scheme. It's an area-based payment. It's expected that this scheme has funding for 400 to 500 successful applicants. And even in this plan, or in this scheme, for successful applicants, they have an option to take on an extra payment or an extra incentive to grow a certain area of red clover over the duration of their plan, and they will get a top-up payment for this. So it's all looking good. Coming from a policy side, the hope is if Europe wants an increase in organic production throughout Europe, hopefully it all will trickle down to all the governments and all the various regions, that funding will be given going forward to help incentivize farmers to farm organically. So just to summarize very quickly, as you can see, the organic sector in Ireland is small, but it is growing. There are opportunities there to grow the sector. Definitely legumes have a role to play to achieve this. In doing this, they're going to provide quality feed, and they're going to produce protein for the organic livestock sector. And policy is being developed to help to enable this. So, Mark, that's
great. Elaine, thank you very much. Elaine, you spoke about red clover, and obviously it's an important part of the organic production systems here in Ireland. But I mean, it has proven as a really useful part of rotations. And why is it that this hasn't been taken up by the wider farming community, what do you think are the limitations there or perceived obstacles?
I think Bob mentioned the cost of it in relation to the cost of putting it in. It is a short-term crop, so it's not a crop that you put in and it's 2, 3, maybe, I know it's longer rotation, but in a cereal rotation, you're talking about maybe 2 to 3 years. Again, it needs, from here in Ireland, from my own experience, it needs, there's a question there about the quality of the land. Red clover needs good quality land because it has a taproot, so it needs to be able to go down into the soil. And then from an organic point of view, it needs to be get good levels of nutrients. It has great capabilities, but it has to be managed well also.
Okay, thanks, Elaine. We're going to move on our schedule now, Elaine, but we will bring you back into our panel discussion later on. But now we're going to see a video from a farmer based in the south of the country. His name is Alan Navertil, and he's going to be speaking to us about field bean production and some of the pros and cons of field bean production.
Well, first and foremost, they're a very handy replacement in the rotation for sugar beet. They're relatively easy to do, particularly if one does it with the one-pass system where it's not so weather sensitive. And thirdly, there's a reasonable cash return on them. Regeneration of the ground is a very important thing because it leaves the ground better than it was before. I think fungal diseases are probably the worst, but then one never knows in advance whether there's going to be a disease pressure or not during the summer. So that's something of a little bit of a gamble, because I try and keep the use of fungicides and chemicals down to the absolute minimum. As regards harvesting, one is to some extent dependent on what the weather is going to be like in the later summer, because they are a late crop. And if the weather in September is reasonable, then it's okay. If it's not, then it's something of a lottery. As regards winter beans versus spring beans, I would prefer winter beans the whole way, but unfortunately, because of this multi-crop rule from Brussels, we have to have more than one sowing, which is rather unfortunate. It's somewhat prejudicial to the acceptance of the crop by a lot of farmers. If we could do it all in the winter and under reasonably good conditions, you're reasonably well assured of a good crop and also of an earlier harvest, whereas the spring beans tend to be a later harvest. Well, will beans have a future? As Mark Twain said, making forecasts is particularly difficult, especially about the future. I wouldn't like to make any forecasts. That rather depends on price, weather conditions and so on. But I don't see why they shouldn't. I mean, there are new varieties coming on stream all the time. If we could breed out of diseases as much as possible, that's to my mind that's the important thing for the future. We need to reduce our dependence on chemicals as far as is humanly possible.
We were really starved for a good rotational crop, and beans are one that has really filled that gap very nicely. They're a very good nutritious source of protein. Farmers have embraced them. They have the machinery to grow them. And they're an ideal crop to put in winter wheat after. So, you know, they're an important crop. And look, they stand up in their own right financially as well. And the Department of Agriculture, to be fair to them in Ireland, have really recognised beans for what they are. I mean, there's no nitrogen go out in them, massive source of protein. And they have rewarded each grower with a very valuable protein payment. So, you know, look, they're gaining popularity as a company. We really embrace them. We put them into most of our feeds at this stage as their protein source, and we're displacing soy with that. So, you know, they're gaining popularity, and in fairness to the Irish grower, they're very conscious of the environment too, and they are supporting it. Once the crop is profitable, they will support it. I suppose the other issue has been research and development. I think that we might be just a little bit slow off the mark over the last couple of years to develop the crop agronomically. But to be fair, Teagasc have really rode in behind that in the last couple of years, and I've no doubt that their investment and their concentration on the crop now will pay dividends over the next couple of years.
Well, for one thing, I think they're a good protein supplement. I think that the stock like them. And I suppose another good reason is that I grow them myself. Yeah, it's grand to think that you can grow a crop that is really useful and wanted, and that it doesn't have to go halfway around the world before you get it back in your feed. They love it, basically, is the bottom line. They love it.
So that was Alan Navratil and Jim Tate and Liam Leahy from Dairy Gold, and we'll be joined by both Liam and Alan during our panel discussion. So we look forward to that. Our next speaker this morning is Michael Hennessy. Michael, good morning to you.
Morning, Mark.
So Michael, you're the head of Teagasc Crops Knowledge Transfer Department. And you're also leading the National Protein Stakeholder Group, which is developing a protein plan for Ireland. This is an exciting development for Ireland.
It is, yeah. We're very much trying to drive on beans, as Liam said there a few minutes ago. So it's part of a national kind of an initiative to try and make sure everybody's on board and everybody's working in the same direction.
Right. So your presentation today you're going to focus on the prospects for legumes in Irish cropping systems. And after you, Michael, then we're going to have an industry perspective from Dave Barry, who's General Manager with Gold Crop. So Michael, we'll hand over to you for your presentation, and we'll speak to Dave then afterwards. And then we'll take some questions then. So please do keep your questions coming through using the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. So Michael, over to you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Mark. Yep. So this morning, and thanks very much for the invite to present to everyone this morning. So this morning, what I'm going to try and do is give a little bit of a flavour about protein concentrates, I suppose, that are grown in Ireland rather than clovers. So from a crop perspective, if you like, trying to give you an idea about the demand that is in Ireland and some of the constraints and the potential opportunities that are there for tillage farmers. So I suppose just to put it in context as regards the potential market that tillage farmers in Ireland have for proteins, we can see over here, and James mentioned earlier that we have a very large bovine the amount of animals in the country. It's not just dairy cows, it's sheep and suckler cows as well, but we also have quite a substantial pig and poultry business as well, along with horses and other things as well. So feeding into that is the Irish grain industry, whether that's barley or wheat, but also pulses feeding into the concentrates that go into that industry. And also there are certainly a number of forages as well that come into it. But to supplement the concentrates, we have quite substantial imports of grains, as was discussed earlier in previous talks. A lot of those are either maize, soybean, and various different guises, whether it's hulls or just straightforward soybean meal, or various other different proteins. So we're very much the same as every other European country in that we need an awful lot of imported protein to keep our animals fed to the correct level. So if we look at, I suppose, some of the quantities and the shape of the imports over the last little while, that from 2000, and James described it earlier in terms of the dairy expansion, that's very much happened since sort of 2014 or thereabouts. And there's been a substantial increase all the way along, all the way back even from 2000 in terms of the imports of feed. And we see a very large spike here in 2018 because we in Ireland had quite a substantial drought in 2018. And obviously if grass doesn't grow, the animals need to be fed a concentrate to try and make up for that. So that can, obviously in terms of climate change, that can happen and probably maybe is happening even more frequently. So to a degree, there's potentially a more of a demand for the likes of the tillage sector to produce more forage in general, and proteins are certainly one of those. In terms of where do the likes of maize, where does that kind of come in, which just gives you an idea, and soya is kind of something similar. Brazil, Ukraine, Canada, and various other countries, our imports come from, I suppose, close to 60 countries in terms of feed back into our industry here. In terms of the grain imports, and I just took 2018, which was an exceptionally high year in terms of imports, that a huge amount of those happen to be GM, and certainly for a huge amount of the soybean happens to be GM as well. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit later on, because I think it does have a potential impact as well in terms of the indigenous protein sources here. Just to recap for a couple of seconds, just in terms of, and James mentioned our land area base, and we're predominantly grazing, whether it's rough grass or whether it's good silage or grazing ground. Our cereals are relatively small, about 6 to 7%, and our combinable break crops, which is up here, which beans are included in here, is only 0.5%. I think it was mentioned in Scotland earlier that they were about 1%. So it is quite small. If we break that down a little bit further and we look at the main crops in 2019, obviously barley, wheat, whether it's winter or spring wheat or barley, that makes up the majority of what we produce here in Ireland, with the likes of beans and peas being a relatively small proportion of the cropped area. So there's obviously potential there to include an awful lot more of those beans within the system, or beans or peas or legumes, if you like, within the system for that rotational benefit that was mentioned earlier on. In terms of Ireland, I suppose, and it was mentioned before, James mentioned that Ireland, it was, I suppose, way back, Ireland was referred to as a grazing country only and not suitable for crops. Well, the coloured dots here gives you an idea within Ireland where the major arable areas are within Ireland. So they tend to be mostly within the eastern side of the country, because it tends to be that little bit wetter towards the west. So it's ground dries a little bit better towards the east, giving it a little bit a much better opportunity to either plant crops or harvest on the other side of the year. So that just gives you a profile of where the arable ground is in Ireland. It was mentioned also that Ireland is very good at growing grass. It certainly is. It's probably one of the highest yielding crops in the country, but it's not just only the best in terms of growing grass. We have an ability to grow very high yields of most crops. And just to give you an idea, in comparison to an international comparison, we can grow the highest yields of wheat in the world, basically, and it's a very similar situation for barley. So our climate, I suppose, as was described by James earlier, being a Cinderella type climate, it's brilliant for growing everything. Not all perfect in terms of cereals, and it was mentioned by Alan in the video a second ago, in terms of our wet climate. Being wet enables us to grow more biomass, but wet conditions bring more disease, and we do have to try and cope with that, and that is certainly a problem. So look, we can grow high yields, and if we look at beans over the period, we have a comparison comparing beans to spring barley, the dark green line on the top. Beans are relatively high yielding here in Ireland at an average yield of about 5.5 tons per hectare, whereas spring barley is a little over 7 tons per hectare. However, it's not all rosy in the camp, I suppose, because beans are that little bit more, and this is fava beans now, they're that little bit more prone to drought, and maybe even more so in comparison to the likes of barley. So as I mentioned before, 2018, it was quite a droughty year. Crop yields were down in general all around. But if we look at a bit of a comparison on each of these years here with the lines on them, there was a relatively dry year. So 2013, 18, and 2020. 18 was a particularly dry year. And you can see that both crops of winter barley and beans reduced. However, the beans reduced about 54% in comparison to their average yield, whereas barley only dropped by 21%. Similar situation in 13, the beans dropped by 6% and very little drop in barley. And 2020, beans dropped by the guts of 13%, and there was very little drop in spring barley up here again. So really what that's kind of driving at there is beans are that little bit more risky. If they're not, if a year comes wrong, if drought or a very dry period comes at the wrong time, they are that little bit more risky to get a return from. So that obviously then comes into in terms of the profitability, if you like, or the margin that you get from beans. And this is just a comparison of spring beans to spring barley. So 2018, obviously, as we mentioned already, there was a very big differential between both of them. Whereas in other years, when yields are in or around similar, spring beans can outcompete spring barley. And of course, that's the crop we need to compare them to, because it is predominantly a spring crop rather than a winter crop so far. That's the most appropriate crop that we should compare them to. So it can be competitive. However, it was mentioned earlier in the video by Liam. He mentioned that there is a government support for proteins. There's a ceiling in Ireland of €3 million, and that's for the eligible crops are beans, peas, and lupins. The majority of that tends to be beans. So as you can see, back in 2014, we had only a little under 3,000 hectares, and by 2020, we're up to about 12,000 hectares. And the little bit here in the middle is probably due to a poor planting season, and obviously as well kind of a washout from poor yields in the previous year, going from 18 to 19. But as you can see, the area has nearly tripled, or a little bit more on average, from 2014 to 18. And in fairness, the payment has been a large factor in that. Without that, beans and peas, in terms of their profitability, but also in terms of the risk our farmers taking from year to year, it needs to be there, so farmers stick with it. So for 2021, so a similar kind of situation. And if we look at, the beans in terms of the average yield in 2021, if we can achieve an average yield with some of the with the protein payment, it compares extremely favorably to the likes of spring barley. You know, the margin is quite a bit above it, and it's starting to touch and challenge margins of some of the winter crops as well. So from that point of view, if everything goes swimmingly well, beans are a very good option. But obviously, as I said before, there are a number of risks. And when we look at farmers, and when we talk to farmers and survey farmers and ask them, well, why aren't you growing more beans? A number of things come to light. Late harvest is certainly one of them. Alan Navarrete mentioned that a few minutes ago, that once beans push into September, our weather does get that a little bit poorer, and it is that little bit more difficult to harvest beans. This yield stability I mentioned already feeds into the profitability issues. Both of those are very closely aligned. That if there's not profitability in it, and it comes to the very last point, a lot of farmers tend to look at it on a very much a 1-year basis, whereas we are really trying very hard to get farmers to look at it in a more rounded, in a rotational basis, and we have a little bit more research and work to do to make that argument a little bit more real for farmers on the ground. So with all that in mind, we developed have brought together a protein stakeholder group, which is a national group comprising of people from the industry, such as Liam and his company, who produce feed to seed companies, to agronomists, to farmers, government, etc. So it's a quite wide-ranging group, with everyone with the overall goal of producing over 100,000 tonnes of indigenous protein crops in Ireland. That's beans and peas, but we think for the most part, that's going to be generally fava beans more so than peas. So that's essentially about another 100% increase in the overall tonnage in comparison to where we are today. So it's quite ambitious, but still, as you can remember, the amount of feed that's required in an Irish context, it's still relatively small, but it's achievable in terms of our rotational slots for the available tillage land or arable ground that's there in Ireland at the moment. So we are in the process of developing a strategy document, and obviously the industry buy-in is essential, so it needs to be very much grounded in their needs and their way of how they can develop it along with farmers for the future. It just doesn't not only concern feed going into animals, but we are stitching in some food elements there. As was mentioned earlier, there's lots of opportunities there, which we would hope to exploit as well. So I suppose the three main pillars of the strategy are, look, first and foremost is to grow more tonnes in Ireland. We need to get the area of it up. So we need to convince, I suppose, more farmers to put more of these legume crops in, but we do need to try and continually address that profitability and stability of yield through improving varieties and agronomic knowledge and practice. On the other side of that then is create more demand for Irish protein crops. And to a degree, you might ask, well, that's a little bit odd. There's loads of demand there anyway. Not necessarily. Often it's easier for merchants to go outside the country for an easier product to put through a mill, whereas fava beans, for instance, they tend to be quite big and a little bit more work involved in getting them through the mill. So we need to work a little bit on that. And also, we think that in terms of their overall nutritional value, that needs to be realigned, and that again is related back to price. So it's trying to create that overall positive relationship between Irish proteins and the price that's paid for them. And lastly, it's creating these support for our export credentials, if you like. And as mentioned by James at the very start, we export a huge amount of our beef and dairy products, and that they are exported, I suppose, on the basis of our green credentials. We are seen as a clean, green type of environment for those products. And obviously, the more of this proteins, indigenous proteins we can get in, the less we import either of soya from the likes of South America that was mentioned before in terms of the loss of biodiversity over there, or even in terms of the less GMs that we feed back into the system, can all make a difference in terms of how those products in terms of beef and dairy can be viewed by the consumers outside Ireland. So it's trying to build and maintain that credibility, and that's where we're really trying to do that. So how are we trying to do that? So once we come up with this strategy, we also, I suppose, in the background, and we have a lot of work ongoing, and this work will continue to support this strategy. We have agronomic trials, a very specific program here in Oak Park, looking at all the various different agronomic parts in terms of improving the growability, the growing of legumes, and obviously trying different legume crops as well. We have variety lists by the Department of Agriculture to make sure that what we are growing is the best ones that are available. Teagasc and others have a number of feeding trials, comparing and trying to, I suppose, make sure that we are really aware of the how good Irish proteins are in comparison to imports. Lots of work on life cycle analysis to feed into that process. And on the ground, because in Teagasc we have a very much an integrated system. On the ground, we have advisors working hand in hand with those researchers, boots on the ground, as Elaine said earlier, in terms of support for agronomists, commercial agronomists, and also farmers on the ground. And certainly then with the industry, from certainly what's coming back through us from the industry, there is a sustainability pressure, if you like, coming from their customers, coming all the way back through the system. And industry want more indigenous protein coming into the system with the kind of the life cycle analysis done on in terms of carbon and other greenhouse gas issues as well. And also we are trying to, I suppose, other industry parts have other higher markets, such as there's gluten-free oats, which needs a crop before it, which is a non-cereal crop, of which the likes of legumes support that extremely well. So there's loads of different angles that we're coming from trying to support this going forward, and we really do hope that we can achieve our aim of 100,000 tons or greater within the next 4 or 5 years. So that's it. It's very short. Just thanks very much to all my colleagues, Kieran Collins, Sheila Alves, and others, and the advisory service, who are all contributing to what we're trying to do. That's it. Thanks very much, Mark.
Thank you, Michael. And what we're going to do, if it's okay with you, Michael, we'll take questions after your presentation, or after Dave's presentation. We'll go straight through to our next presenter, who's Dave Barry. He's General Manager with Gold Crop and responsible for grass and forage crop seeds. Gold Crop is the largest seed wholesaler in Ireland, covering all agricultural seeds, arable and forage. And he will provide us with an industry perspective on the prospects for legumes in Ireland. Good morning, Dave. How are you today?
Hi, Mark. How are you? Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you okay. Yes, we can indeed. And we can see your presentation nice and clear. So we'll let you plow on.
Thanks, Mark. Look, firstly, I'd like to thank you for the invitation to speak today. It's been very interesting listening to all the presentations so far, and gives, I suppose, a much more in-depth knowledge and view of things than we come across on a normal daily basis. So I just have a number of slides just to give you a picture of, I suppose, how we see things. And look, firstly, just to introduce myself, I work with Goldcrop. We're a seed wholesale company, and we would be the biggest seed wholesale company in Ireland if you take the combination of all the different seeds that we supply. So as I say, our main area of business is seed. Our route to market is we supply the retail trade. So it's the agricultural cooperatives and the agricultural retailers, and they then, you know, supply the products onto farmers. A number of the areas that we're involved in are essentially governed by recommended lists. If you take cereals and if you take grass seeds and clover, and look, we have a stake in you know, having varieties that we represent, getting them on recommended lists. So look, our aim is look to supply any seed that a farm may require, whatever it is, and look, in the past, you know, I suppose the crop mix that was there, we look a lot of cereals, a lot of grass. There are certainly farmers out there that are interested in looking at alternatives, and we field more questions now in the last couple of years about alternatives in forage cropping, and also look at alternatives in the arable cropping. One interesting, I suppose, very important part of our business is that we're a partner with Teagasc in their grass and clover breeding program, which is in Oak Park in Carlow. And look, they've had a very successful, you know, 30-year period in terms of breeding grass varieties that work very well in Ireland and also in the UK. But even more so in terms of clover breeding, and white clover in particular, they've had some really good varieties that worked well across a lot of different countries around the world. And lately then, okay, we currently have a very good red clover variety that's on the UK recommended list. There isn't actually a red clover list in Ireland, and that has very good credentials. So I suppose to sum up, what we like to do is, our ideal scenario for business is we supply seeds, the farmer sows them and produces a profitable crop that he's satisfied with and has good outcomes from, and he comes back for more seed then the following year. And whether that's an arable crop or whether he's sown a white clover, red clover mixture and finds it very good, and then he does another field on the farm. And I suppose the other thing to say is, look, springtime for us, we're always optimistic. We're always expecting the weather and the markets and everything to be good in any particular year. So just, I suppose, I'm mostly going to concentrate on the forage side of things, so white clover, red clover, and I'll have a look at, I suppose, what's happened or what's been happening in the market or in the industry for the last 20 years. And then I'll look up ahead and see, you know, the influences that are there, and see where things might go up ahead and some of the challenges to that. But I suppose the basis for our forage seeds getting into the market is mostly with reseeding. There's a small amount of overseeding done, but it's mostly reseeding. So I just wanted to give an idea of the level of reseeding that takes place. And I suppose, look, I showed another map of Ireland, and you've seen a few already. And Michael highlighted the area being sort of the south and up through the east. That was the main arable area. That's also, this whole area down here is also the main intensive dairy part of the country. And, you know, particularly, like you can see the valleys here, the river valleys right through the southeast, and then up through this plain up here in Dublin, Meath, Kildare. This is all very, very highly fertile, you know, land that's capable of growing arable crops and capable of being excellent dairy land. There's also a significant amount of dairy in the west of the country and in the northern area. But look, the way you put it, I suppose, is the challenges are a little higher. From our perspective, in terms of the reseeded area, if I look back over 20 years, there's about 100,000 hectares of land reseeded on average. And it depends on the year then, and the weather being the biggest deciding factor, and maybe also then milk price. So it's about 2.7% of the improved grassland area in the country. So that's kind of our opportunity to get seeds into the ground, or to get species into the ground. So in terms of then looking back over the last 15 years, and just to give a view on where, you know, what's the usage been of white clover, red clover, lucerne, and I've just done an average on the seed import figures for the last 15 years. And because we don't produce any of those seeds in Ireland, anything that's going to be, you know, used in the industry is going to have to be imported, and the Department of Agriculture have a good reporting structure to identify all seed that comes in. What I haven't included here is some seed comes in mixtures, and okay, I don't have a breakdown of mixtures, so I don't know, but I can assume it might be another 5% onto the figures here in terms of total usage. So 140 tons of white clover over the past, you know, on average per year. And okay, the white clover obviously is by far the main species of legume used in swards. The 5.5 tons for red clover, again, look, that's been, some years it's 3 tons, some years it's been 6 tons. And the lucerne really is only something that, you know, it's you get a few inquisitive farmers every year that want to try it out and want to have a look. And unfortunately, they don't, you know, there doesn't tend to be a lot of repetition. They don't tend to come back the second and third year. And look, that's partly due to, look, from my point of view, I would say, look, lucerne is a fantastic species in a dry country. Probably doesn't have a huge amount to offer us here at the moment anyway. So again, just further looking at that, in terms of the white clover, we would have seen that the average usage, the average imports in the last 4 or 5 years have reduced down to more like 100, 120 tons. If you go back, you know, we'll say 15 years ago, almost every bag of grass seed that went out, and normally it's 12 and 13 kilo packs, which are designed to sow an acre. But almost everyone had a half kilo of white clover included, you know, sort of 15, 20, 25 years ago. And you could almost call it passive usage, because the farmers didn't specify it should be there or that it shouldn't be there. And look, everybody in the industry kind of saw a value to clover without ever any, you know, without too many farmers properly managing it or changing the management structure to cope for it. And in many cases, look, they just went out with a broad spectrum weed spray the following year and killed it out of it without even thinking about it. So that's where we've come from. Look, things have changed in the last 7 or 8 years, and you know, to an extent, it's because there's been a lot more focus on grassland management and on getting the best out of swards. And what we've seen is that about a third of the grass mixtures that go out now have no clover inclusion, and it comes from farmers looking for that. They've demanded of their retailers that the mixtures that are supplied don't have any clover. And it's kind of the more intensive farmers that tend to specify that. And look, it seems that, look, they just don't want the complication of clover in the system. There's still about a third of it going out with the half kilo, and it's probably, you know, the general purpose mixtures, and still quite a few of the graze mixtures would have, all right. But there's also, you know, farmers looking for high clover mixtures, and this is becoming more, you know, it's becoming more important each year. So we're using a similar quantity of clover overall, but now we have about a third of the mixtures gone out with a kilo or more. And look, in terms of the development of that, it really developed, I suppose, from very positive trial work that took place even 15 and 20 years ago. And I just referenced, I suppose, within the agricultural trade, a man who previously worked with Dairy Gold Co-op, Donald Corkery. He was probably the first technical, you know, a guy to say, look, clover really has to be a part of the future. And he actually at the time increased the mixtures, that their main grazing mixture up to 1.8 kilos of clover in the mixture. And since then, look, in our own mixtures, in our mainstream grazing mixtures, we have a kilo of clover in there now. And look, while there was a little bit of resistance to it a few years ago, it's settling in now. So in terms of red clover, then, as I said, look, it's a smaller amount, and it tends to be honest, it's mostly what's used on organic farms. So then, look, just I suppose, and I'm just giving a kind of look. My job is as an industry perspective, so I'm giving it as I see it from our point of view, or the feedback that we get from the industry. But certainly, there is great potential to increase clover use on grassland farms. White clover for grazing, obviously red clover for silage, which hasn't been exploited at all on mainstream farms. And look, we've also begun to look at other legume species that may have something to offer, that may have a place in a grazing sward, or maybe a place in a silage sward. And we have a number of species on hand this year that we want to have a look at out on farms, and in a research setting. And I suppose, again, the way we'd see it, the target outcomes would be that, look, fertilizer nitrogen use would be reduced, but productivity on farms would be maintained, and maybe we could accept a small reduction, but maintained ideally. And again, another aim to increase the food protein content of silages and conserved feeds, so that there's less dependence on imported high protein concentrate feeds. And then, look, obviously, an improved carbon footprint. And again, from my point of view, it's really important to say that Teagasc have carried out some excellent research work on white clover over the last 10 years. And I'd reference Solohead, where James Humphreys has done a huge amount of work, Moore Park, and also Clonakilty. And it's very, how would you say, trial work that's very, it's very adaptable in terms of farms come in and look at it, and they could actually apply what they see on their own farms. So, and it demonstrates how to use clover and overcome the challenges that are there. Obviously, they've demonstrated the nitrogen savings and continued with excellent sward and animal performance. The difficulty is that this research is very slow and being adopted at farm level. Okay, I'm listing a number of the obstacles that we hear back when we get feedback in terms of what people think of clover. These are the things they say. So bloat fear is a big one. So they're worried that there'll be an animal turned over in the fields, during the day, and if they've left the farm for a few hours or whatever. A fear of reducing spring yields. So from a grazing point of view, issues about clover persistence and how to maintain it. A big enough issue in the last year or two has been weed control tools that are available for clover swards. And okay, post sowing, just after sowing, in an ideal world, you go in and give it a good broad spectrum herbicide to take care of things like docks and thistles. One of the very useful active ingredients that we've had available over the years, has now been, well, there's difficulties at the moment. It may come back for this year with a derogation, but that creates a big issue because farmers, while they can accept growing clover, they may not want to grow docks and thistles right across their field. And even in established swards, we have a few herbicides available, but the options are limited and they're not as reliable as some of the herbicides that are essentially not clover safe. I suppose another obstacle is nitrogen has been relatively cheap in the last number of years. And then another point, that intensive farmers, they've started viewed high clover swards as being unfashionable or uncool. And maybe it goes back to 10 or 12 years ago, we had a rural environmental protection scheme, the REP scheme from Europe. And one of the main, I suppose, parts of that was people using high clover. Did the intensive farmers think that it wasn't the thing to do on their farm? Something, I think it is definitely part of, we need to make clover cool. So look, the challenge as I see it is, look, or as the industry sees it, get the research messages out to farmers. Also, I think plant breeding has to contribute more in terms of solutions to some of those fears that farmers have in terms of spring yield, bloat, and persistence. And we need breeding programs that can, put in selection pressures to select for varieties to achieve those aims. And then, look, we need weed control solutions, because good intensive farmers don't, as I said, they don't want to grow weeds across their field. And then I've listed a number of pull and push motivation factors that are in place, and maybe that could be used a little more. But in terms of pull factors that are there at the moment, the things that might influence a farmer, okay, he can expect that his cost of production should reduce. He'll reduce his fertilizer nitrogen dependence. And from an environmental point of view, then look, nitrogen fixation on the farm is very positive. A lower carbon footprint, less ammonia and nitrous oxide gas emissions, lower food miles, greater self-sufficiency from animal feed point of view on the farm, and then biodiversity and environmental benefits. And certainly in the last year or two, there's a lot more inquiries from farmers looking for something to increase the biodiversity on their farm. So these are our potential helpers in increasing the amount of legume and clover that would be used. And then look, at the moment, there's a number of push factors in place on nitrogen derogation farms in particular. There is a limit on how much fertilizer nitrogen they can use, first of all. And now, since 2020, it's specified that when they're reseeding, they have to include 1.5 kilos of white or red clover per hectare. And there's also limits on the crude protein content of the concentrates feeds that they use. And then I would also say a push factor is, this year particularly, fertilizer and nitrogen costs have gone up significantly, so that would push people in towards legumes. Other push factors that could be used, look, all reseeding mixtures could be specified to include clover, and that's a possibility. An obligation to other than just the ones that are being reseeded, an obligation to overseed clover into swards. and then maybe further reductions on the amount of concentrate feed protein content that can be supplied. And then I forgot to mention one there in terms of further restrictions on nitrogen use. So then just look, I've only a couple of more slides, but look, I suppose from our point of view in gold crop, the outlook that we see in terms of as I say, clover in particular, we expect a significant increase in clover usage on farms, and it's kind of driven by the pull and the push factors. The tide is turning, and look, the farmers are not immune to the environment and biodiversity and carbon footprint debate. They do hear all that stuff, and in most cases, if it fits their system, they are prepared to adopt practices to help. We have, from I suppose a gold crop point of view, we have about 10 different white clover varieties that are in Irish and UK official trials. They're on their way through the trial process at the moment, and they're very high performing in comparison to a lot of the material, I suppose, that's existing in the market. We have seed production underway for that already. So if you like, we're gearing up for having very high performing varieties and having an increased demand in the market. And we also have, as I mentioned earlier, Fergal red clover, which is it's probably the top performing variety in the UK recommended list, but there's no seed. There's no seed available as yet because we're still in the final stages of getting to the commercial seed, which we will have for next year. So that's I suppose my take on the forage legume side of things. And look, just again, without leaving the opportunity pass, and just a few comments on the arable crop legumes, because my colleague Donald Fitzgerald looks after our arable crops within gold crop, and look, we're a significant stakeholder in that part of the business as well. And look, as has been mentioned, look, it's beans and peas is where it's at, and it's by far and away mostly beans. It's been, I suppose, from our point of view, there's an unpredictable area zone, and you can see the figures that Michael had. 18 and 19 had significant drops in the area zone, and from our point of view, then in assembling seed, that presents a challenge because we want to have the seed that farmers require, but how far in advance will we know? Will we be certain what actually the tonnage requirement is? Spring sowing for beans is very weather dependent, and in some seasons, with the best intentions, farmers just don't get what they want to get sown, and then wet weather diseases like beans for beans are an issue. Peas, big issue is lodging risk. And I suppose, and again, Michael touched on it, inconsistent crop results for farmers is probably one of the drivers of where the acreage is at. But again, we'd be very optimistic. I would also, and my last two comments are really, I feel that, look, there's a lack of spend on the breeding of cropping legumes in comparison to the amount of resources that are put into breeding cereal crops and some of the other crops in the system. And also from an Irish perspective, not a lot of that breeding is in our climate zone. In fact, very little of it is. And then, so I'd love to look what Alan was looking for, solve the disease problem. I'd love to be able to have a breeding program that could come up with solutions for that. So look, that's my quick whistle stop tour of the industry perspective. So thank you everyone for your attention.
Thank you, Dave. You covered a lot of ground there in a short period of time, so we do appreciate that. And it's always good to get an industry perspective. A question for you, Michael, around the desire to grow more beans, but yet we want to. There's policies there to cut the crude proteins within feeds. How does that tally?
I don't think they're incompatible at all, to be honest with you, because I suppose cutting crude protein in feed is going from a relatively high level down to arguably an acceptable level. So there's still a deficit, if you like, in there between, I suppose, a normal grain such as wheat or barley, etc., to bring that up to that acceptable level. So there still will be a very high level of protein requirement in Ireland, whether that is in the ruminant rations or in the monogastric pigs or poultry. So there's plenty of scope there still.
Okay, thanks. And David, can I turn to you in relation to you mentioned breeding as that there are opportunities there to exploit maybe better traits coming through from clovers and legumes in general. What would you like to see happening there to improve the rate of development of those new varieties?
Yeah, and I suppose I'd start at the point of maybe the data that's presented to farmers and to the industry about clovers. It's a very narrow band of data. It's basically a total annual yield of the clover within in a mixed sward. First of all, I'd like to see more comprehensive data in terms of the recommended list, because the recommended list really and the performance of varieties on that is a significant driver for the breeders themselves, because they want to get their varieties high up on a list and performing well for the trades. So I'd like to see a list that categorizes varieties for spring yield, for persistence, and look, those two alone will motivate breeders. And what we're looking for really is the varieties that can tolerate the production systems that are practical on farm. So I'd love if there was a solution from a bloat perspective. If we could come up with varieties, particular types of varieties that would reduce the risk of bloat and make it more manageable on farm. So that the spring growth and also the persistence issue. Now, certainly there is work ongoing on this, but look, as everyone would be aware, the process of developing a new variety is quite a slow process, sort of 15 or more years from start to finish. So it's underway, but I'd like to see more progress from that point of view. But I'd like to see recommended lists, or measuring some of these traits in order to drive the breeding industry.
Thanks, Dave. And Michael, just in relation to the stakeholder group, what are the key recommendations coming? I know you've talked about most of them within your presentation, but what would you say would be the top 3 recommendations that you'd like to see adopted as soon as possible in order to accelerate this adoption?
Yeah, Mark, look, I suppose the strategy is not totally finished as yet. It's still in distilling, if you like. So we're kind of getting there. But like I said, the very biggest one is that there is so much more capacity for more of the grain legumes to be grown in Ireland. That's the first and foremost thing. So there is demand there, but we need that profitability proportion in it as well. So that profitability has kind of got 2 sides. And as mentioned before, one of them is to do it around agronomy and yield stability. So we just need to get that risk down, if you like, from farmers with a relatively stable yield. And the other side to drive that profitability is a better recognition of the nutritional profile that's in beans in particular. So they're kind of the biggest ones just so far. Food, I think, is still a little ways off. There's a good bit more that needs to be done. I suppose in industry, we're very similar to the likes of Scotland. There's no dehulling and there's no other further processing here in Ireland, but that's something we would love to see develop a bit further to add more value to some of the beans that are being produced.
Okay. Thank you both for your presentations and really insightful responses there, because I mean it is always good. You both have excellent experience at all levels within the industry, so it's excellent to get that. Now I'd like to invite our speakers from throughout the day to join us now for our final part of today, which is our panel discussion. So if all of our speakers could turn on their speakers and their cameras as well. I'd like to introduce Liam Leahy, who works with Dairy Gold Cooperative. He's a beef and tillage business manager, and Dairy Gold is Ireland's leading farmer-owned cooperative with 2,850 milk producers. And processes 17% of Ireland's milk pool. So Liam, you're very welcome to our panel. And we're also joined by Alan Navratil, who featured in the video earlier on. And Alan, you're very welcome to the panel today as well. You might be hiding in the background there, Alan, but feel free to join us. And we're also joined by Henrik Mab from University of Hohenheim, who is heavily involved in the TRUE project. So thank you all for your excellent presentations today. And we just remind everybody, if you do have a question for the panel, please do submit them now, because we will be wrapping up our session this morning at 12:15. But if I could maybe turn to James first. James, we've had a lot of discussion today about the importance of breeding and accelerating breeding programs, and you've obviously been experimenting a lot with different clover varieties in Solohead over the years. What do you see needs to happen over the next number of years to try and accelerate, like we were talking with Dave earlier on there, to accelerate that breeding or investment? Bob also mentioned it in his presentation, the need for increased effort and investment in breeding.
I think Teagasc have, as Dave said, Teagasc have been very successful in coming up with new varieties. I don't see that. I was very interested in Dave's comment there that breeding to reduce bloat could be a good objective. I think that's definitely a major obstacle in farmers' minds. But in terms of new varieties coming on stream, I think Teagasc have been quite good in that regard. We are seeing increases in productivity, whether that's coming from breeding, whether it's coming from improved management, actually warmer climate conditions that we're seeing. So, like, if we track our changes in terms of productivity in Solohead over the last 20 years, we're seeing very steady progress in terms of once upon a time, we'd been happy to grow 13 tons of dry matter per hectare. Now, we'd be disappointed if we're not growing 16, 17 tons of dry matter per hectare with low nitrogen fertilizer inputs. So it's there has been good progress. It's not something I would identify personally as being a major obstacle.
It was observed, maybe not specifically in relation to clovers, but Bob, maybe you'd like to pick up on that point that you'd mentioned about maybe the need within the UK. I think, was that a need that you had identified for increased effort on the breeding side? Maybe it was broader legume crops that you were referring to.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that breeding for legume crops has been very much neglected by comparison to the main arable crops that we have.
Sorry, we have somebody just interrupting there. If you aren't speaking, maybe I could ask whoever is in the background there just to mute their microphone. Sorry, Bob.
But one of the other things I think worth mentioning is what we're breeding for is important. So, I mean, historically, we've bred for things like yield and productivity, but I mean, you know, I showed some data there to show that different varieties of grain legumes have different nitrous oxide emissions. So if we're interested in these crops as being a way of mitigating climate change, then breeding for low emission varieties would be an important goal as well.
Liam, if I could turn to you in relation to just another industry perspective. Liam, have you seen an increased demand for legume-based diets?
Yeah, look, they've certainly gained popularity. There's no question or doubt about that. Now, as a company, I'd like to think that we pretty well supported them. But if I had to be truthful with you, I'd be disappointed that there isn't more of a demand for them. I don't think the industry are identifying them. I think the industry has a part to play in this too, of identifying homegrown legumes versus imported protein sources. You know, maybe we have something to do with that too, but I suppose the supply of them that we have as well is limited enough from the point of view that it doesn't encourage us to go out and make bold statements on it. But have we an extra demand from? Yes, but not as much as I would have thought.
And in relation to, Elaine, in relation to the supports that are available there within the organic sector, you know, are they sufficient, do you think, to improve the uptake of, obviously legumes are a cornerstone of organic production. Do you think that there is enough support there to make that transition?
From transition from organic to non-organic, it's an area-based payment. The payment is quite good. Look at as farmers would take more if they were given more. It certainly is a help, and it wouldn't be seen as a positive payment for what farmers are getting. Maybe I suppose we need to focus more maybe on the farming practices element as well, is another aspect we need to look at. There is an incentive, I said there, for the red clover, but it's a payment of €30 a hectare up to 10 hectares to incorporate red clover. That is presently there. That's what it is in relation to the red clover element of the scheme.
Okay, thanks, Elaine. And just if any of the panelists want to come in or any comments, please do raise your hand or just unmute yourself. We'll be happy to take any comments from you. Pete, you talked a lot in your presentation about the added value that legumes have to offer. We've recently in Teagasc seen a lot of presentations around the circular bioeconomy, and it struck me during your presentation that the role of legumes they have a huge part to play in the circular bioeconomy and increasing the value added within supply chains. Perhaps you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Certainly, I wouldn't underestimate consumer demand for legumes. We had a particular report that came out from a project on diet in Ireland, and similar to diet in Scotland, it doesn't make for great reading. And certainly there's a need to reduce meat consumption. That doesn't mean we need to reduce meat production, because there's huge demand coming from outside Ireland and the UK. But nevertheless, animals need fed cheaply, let's be honest. Whereas if you're providing legumes for human consumption, the markets are far more lucrative. Aquaculture is also another lucrative market. So I certainly wouldn't underestimate consumption change. I wouldn't underestimate the increasing awareness among consumers. They're asking more and more for companies to show us your numbers with regard to carbon or biodiversity or whatever the unique selling point happens to be. And the companies are stepping up to that. They're realizing the marketing power of that. And that goes for all the meat products as well as it does all the products that might be fed directly to people. So certainly sustainability is definitely the new language of marketing, and I wouldn't underestimate the pull from the human food market. But also, particularly for Ireland, I'm looking at the policy agendas. They're critical, and the subsidies that are available. We're seeing essentially the making of a carbon or nitrate directive in terms of greenhouse gas mitigation and adaptation. I suspect the soil directive may not be far behind. Maybe Bob would like to comment on that. So the policy framework is really important, but certainly for me, I look towards the large industry players to step up here. They're the people that can make, you can do short supply chains and they're all great, they're fantastic ventures. They help farmers become more profitable, but I'm looking towards the big industrial players who can really make transformations happen on a grand scale. I'm wondering where they are and when they will step up.
So interesting times ahead. So from that perspective, Dave, if I could ask you, just from a policy perspective, what policies incentives would you like to see in place to increase the use and, I suppose, the consumption of legumes?
Yeah, so this past year we had the farmers in derogations have an obligation to include the 1.5 kilos of clover per hectare, and it is having a positive effect. And I think I mentioned that the combination of pull and push factors. I suppose the big driver is if we can educate people to come along and go the path that we want them to go. That's the best way to do it. But outside of that, I do think we need some push factors as well. And I suppose in maybe in combination with the next cap that comes along and tied in with the payments that farmers get, if we can almost enforce a certain amount of adoption of legumes. And definitely, things like changes to stocking rates that are on farms and changes to the allowable use of nitrogen. Look, if there are limitations there, it is going to push people in the direction of legumes anyway. But I prefer to do it without being as harsh as that on people. So yeah, I think specifying that clover would be included would be a very positive one. Look, I expect nitrogen limits to come down the track anyway, and that will drive people in this direction also.
Bob, if I could turn to you in relation to that same question, the policy type measures that are being implemented or are in the pipeline within UK. I know there's a transition with Brexit and so forth, but there's a lot more, I suppose, ownership being taken of some of the measures being implemented at a farm level. What's coming down the tracks for UK farmers in terms of improving the uptake of legumes?
Well, I guess historically in the UK, there's been a reluctance to use policy instruments to try to control farmers. The voluntary approach has been one that's been favoured. But I think one thing that we've missed in the conversation so far is this flow of money that's going to come into agriculture over the next decade or so in order to support the policy initiatives. And that flow isn't necessarily going to come from government. I think the private sector are very interested in putting money into this. So there are opportunities for carbon trading in agriculture, which have not really been sort of touched on yet. It started in the peatland and forestry sectors in the UK, but I think agriculture is the next sort of piece in the agenda. And there are potentially large sums of money that could flow into agriculture to support low carbon farming. Which will, inevitably, I think, be helpful to the legume sector.
So you see that coming through from the marketplace, signals coming through from the marketplace, right through to farmers.
I mean, as I say, it's 3.5 billion that's been suggested as a figure that's going to need to be needed to transform the sector, and that's not all going to come from government. There's going to have to be private sector involvement.
Very good. Andy,
Mark, can I?
Yeah, of course. Sorry, Michael. And just before we go to Michael, just before we go to Michael, just Andy, I know you're in the background there. If there are any questions, please do come in. I see some questions coming in from our audience. So Michael, sorry, if you want to comment on that.
Just in terms of I suppose a policy intervention in a large scale basis, if you like. I mean, beans are competing with, I suppose, other technologies in terms of GM. Most beans, soybeans that are coming in are GM'd, and we're trying to compete within that kind of space. So I suppose a key policy intervention has been alluded to a number of different times here in terms of our varieties to be able to get a better type of variety that's more suitable for us. Obviously, the gene editing part comes into that somewhere. Many would argue that that should be available to breeders within Europe and the resulting varieties available to.
Sorry, Michael, your sound seems to be fading on us a little bit.
Okay, can you hear me any better now? No?
Yeah, that's you were talking about the technologies, the gene editing technologies.
Yeah, so look, there's a potential there, certainly, I think, in the future for some of these gene editing technologies to be used in the correct way to help beans be more competitive on a global basis with, fava beans or peas, if you like, with other GMs that are out there.
Okay. Andy, some questions coming in from the audience there.
Yeah, as well, just one or two things. Just one for Dave. You mentioned other species, Dave, that you're looking at in relation to leguminous crops. Did you? Have you? Could you elaborate on what other species you were talking about?
Yeah, and look, I suppose we take our direction on this from I suppose research people and maybe farmers who have tried stuff out. But this year, look, we brought in a grazing lucerne variety because I mentioned earlier on that I don't really see lucerne fitting in to any great extent here from a forage point of view or from a silage or a hay point of view, because we just don't have the climate that needs it or suits it. But if we had a good grazing lucerne, it could have something to offer. So we're going to look at that. A bird's foot trefoil and an Alside clover. They're the three that I have new that I've never looked at before that we're going to try and have a look at both on farms and at a research perspective. But look, I would certainly say that the big area and the big game is really always going to be white clover and red clover, as I see it at the moment anyway.
And another question there, I don't know whether it's who would like to take it, maybe James, or is there going to be, would say we talk about the intensive farmers at the moment who don't seem to want, Dave mentioned this guy's looking for grass seed and don't want clover in it. Is there going to be an issue with multi-species swards? Will they go down the multi-species sward route as opposed to maybe putting in clover? I don't know, who would like to, that Dave or James or
yeah, look,
Liam
I can make a comment on it, and I also mentioned, look, that the intensive farmers, they are interested in playing their part, and both playing their part and appearing to play their part. And we certainly have had a lot more discussion with people and a lot more talk, and fielded a lot more questions about multi-species swards. Now, the debate so far and the information we've seen so far, and look, we analyze it from our perspective and how we see it adding value from a farmer's perspective. And the multi-species data I see, and my feeling on it, is that the main benefits that are coming in terms of trial work are essentially being derived from the legumes that are in those swards. That's the way it appears to me. So a multi-species approach to me is fundamentally, there's going to be a lot of legume in that anyway. So that's a positive thing. The intensive farmers, they are prepared to look at stuff, but I think we need to solve some of the problems, or make it adaptable to their management systems, or make simple changes to the recommended management systems that they have in order to get this whole thing to work. So there are people there that are interested, and certainly, look, we've had a good few inquiries about, maybe someone's on a 10-acre field of a sward, and they want to put in an acre or two of a multi-species or a high legume element in it, just to try and have a look at that and see how it works on their farm. So look, people are interested, and I think the multi-species one incorporates the legume message.
Okay, James, I say this one might be directed towards you. It's relating really to the importance of legumes in nitrogen fixation, in biological nitrogen fixation. And they just wanted to know from the Teagasc team, has there been any assessment in Ireland and how much N is fixed? And is there any work done on improving biological fixation through the use of selected or elite inoculants?
Just to follow up on the last question, I'd agree entirely with what Dave said about the multi-species. It's the legumes are the major component in terms of the increasing productivity and any environmental benefits. There may be some benefits with the other components. With regard to nitrogen fixation, I suppose a lot of the work that we've been doing has been focused on improving our management to improve fixation. In other words, can we increase the clover content? Can we increase the productivity of the clover? And fixation tends to follow on from that. In terms of using inoculants, it's not something that we've done. I know that Pete talked about it earlier on. I'm interested in Dave's comments there about using lucerne, a grazing variety of lucerne. I think if that was the case, we may have to look at inoculants with that. But I think in terms of red clover, white clover, the general feeling is that in most cases in Ireland and most soils, the natural background rhizobium is sufficient to support it.
Okay, so thank you, James. We're getting tight on time, but I do want to give the last word to our farmer panelists today, Alan Navratil. Alan, can you hear us okay?
I can hear you perfectly. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can. We can hear you perfectly, Alan.
I have a small technical hitch here in that my steam-driven computer won't work, and you won't see my ugly mug. But isn't that your?
But that's fine, Alan. We can hear you loud and clear. My question to you, Alan, is what measures would you like to see happening over the next number of years to support better uptake of legumes in Irish agriculture or European agriculture?
That's an enormous question. Could I come at it in a slightly different way? I think we're in different times now where we're having to look at decarbonizing the entire world. And I believe our focus as farmers needs to be to provide food for our populations as efficiently as is possible. In addition to that, I don't wish to be critical of anybody here, but it's an objective statement. The Hager-Bosch system of producing nitrogen has been absolutely wonderful, but it also produces CO2 in vast quantities. And I believe as farmers globally, we have to learn how to do without as much nitrogen. And one of the ways that sticks out a mile, and that is, the gentleman from Goldcrop, Dave Barry, mentioned this, is to use clover to better effect. And I seem to recall quite a few years ago, I think it was Professor Boyle of UCC, worked out that using nitrogen on a grass sward requires about 4 hundredweights of nitrogen per annum, but that you could achieve that same optimum level with good clover sward management. I couldn't possibly disagree with that. We need to look at all sorts of other things, and such as perhaps the old Norfolk rotation, maybe the use of biochar, as a gentleman mentioned earlier in the meeting. We need to play to our strengths, and one of our strengths is our soils, and our soil quality has to be kept up. And the soils are, as you all know, gentlemen, are a very complex multi-organism resource. And I don't think we should do anything to our soils that would damage that. We need I just have some notes here and I'll quickly cover them. We need to play to our strengths. We need to improve our plant breeding for disease and pest resistance. I believe that we need to farm in better biological balance. And possibly from a political point of view, the subsidized system of being paid at the moment by the EU to actually own and occupy land is perhaps flawed. And maybe we should refocus those subsidies to farm organically, provided that we can still produce the same net amount of food for each person that requires food. We also are having to look at a global factor of a population increase, which has gone something like fourfold in my lifetime, and I'm 83, and that's unsustainable. At the moment, the globe is increasing at the rate of 83 million people per annum. And we need to bear that in mind, and possibly by 2050, our global population could be around about 9.5 to 10 billion. Those are the challenges I think we need to be considering. And I don't think I've got much more to add to that comprehensive.
Thank you, Alan. No, it's very, very wise words indeed. And we really do appreciate your contribution here today. So thank you. And that brings us to the close of our session here today. I want to thank all of our speakers and for their presentations, and all of the contributors throughout. There's quite a lot of preparation went into today, as you will know, and so I'm going to hand the final words over to James Humphreys, who's the lead organizer of today's event. From myself, I want to thank everybody for their help in organizing today, and we hope you enjoyed today's presentations. They will be available on the Teagasc website, and I'm sure other websites, the True website also. A recording of today will be available also. So James, we'll hand over to you to close the agenda out for us today, and thank you again.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I just put up there on the screen the various people involved. I particularly like to thank the farmers, Alan Navratil, Jim Tate and Michael Gowan, for putting themselves out there in terms of the videos, the speakers, Bob Elaine, Michael, David and Liam Leahy from Dairygold. You can see the organising committee there. I want to particularly thank Mark for masterminding the events today, and Andy for the questions. Particularly mention Dan Clavin there, who worked on the project for the last 4 years and has now left Teagasc to take up a new career in Canada. And Declan McCardle there for the videos. Huge amount of work put in over the last few days getting ready for this. Eric Donald and Tara Guinan for the PR. And with that, I'd also like to thank you, the audience, for your participation and your interaction during the meeting. As Mark said, the presentations will be available on the Teagasc and the True project website. And with that, I say stay safe and goodbye.
Okay, thanks everybody. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.